Chapter 432. As they looked down from the hole, Natha and Akasha realized that the magic tower was not as simple as it looked. Even the Pasha magic tower did not have a hollow design at the bottom. Everyone knew the importance of the foundation, and Akasha also knew the truth that the higher the building, the deeper the foundation. But now it seemed that the tower that the two saw from the outside could only be called a small part of the top of the magic tower. In short, the magic tower that outsiders saw was just the tip of the iceberg. Other than the ice crystal vein, Akasha and Natha were not interested in exploring anything else. They knew that it was not the time to be in a daze. After standing there for more than 10 seconds, they both took a step back and looked at the rooms above the tower. If the tower is broken, what should we do? Akasha's question was more like a question to herself. Although Natha knew the pros and cons, she did not know magic and knew that she could not make any effective decisions. After thinking for a while, she replied, "First, make sure we survive. Then, we go find Roddy and the team." Survive, she understood the logic and the goal, but Akasha knew how difficult it was. If it was just an attack from the orcs or the undead, it would not be difficult. But those terrifying existences just now were beyond their understanding. Which one of them could they handle? At this point, they could only rely on their brains to think of a solution. Go up and take a look at these rooms. It would be best if we can find another way out. Although Akasha remained gentle and calm when she was with Rhodey, she was, after all, a captain who had led a team. At this time, when she saw that Nada had no opinion, she took the initiative to stand up and make a decision. "Keep some distance from me. If we fall into a trap, we can take care of each other," Akasha said as she walked up the stairs. She could see some scorch marks on the ground, which should have been caused by the elemental flame demon. Other than that, everything around her was clean. As they walked up the stairs, there was no movement. The only thing they could hear was their breathing and footstep. When they reached the second floor, they both noticed the exaggerated graffiti in the High Elves' language on the stone wall. A bunch of frogs at the bottom of a well. Under Roddy's guidance and self-study, Akasha had learned most of the High Elves' language. She couldn't help but spell out the sentence. She read it a few times and found that although the handwriting looked casual, it was not simple at all. Because it was directly carved on the stone wall through some kind of force, it was not the work of a sharp object. As they continued to walk forward, they could see similar marks on the walls. The 127th experiment failed. "I don't believe I can't handle it. This is the 13th year. Idiots of Elson, just you wait." It sounded like someone's rambling, but after deciphering a few sentences, Akasha felt that something was wrong. Wasn't Elson the capital of the High Elves? Did the person who wrote this have a grudge against them? While he was thinking, Natha, who had been silent all this while, suddenly said, "There's something strange here, What's strange about it?" Akasha turned her head. "Although I don't recognize these, look. Other than these graffiti, it seems like there are no words anywhere else." Natha's words made the young priest, who was still thinking, widen her eyes. It would have been better if he hadn't mentioned it, but when he looked around, the words that should have been on the door or outside the door were all bare. When she was in the Pasha Magic Tower, those rooms were marked with the words Specimen Room, Herb Storage Room, Elemental Laboratory, and so on. There was no need to explain the purpose of the words. But why couldn't she see any words here? Did they not have time to write? That can't be right. Akasha stopped and reached out to touch the stone door that was supposed to have words on it. She didn't expect that the door would open silently. The scene in the room made the two people outside jump in fright at the same time. In the stone room that looked more than 50 square meters, there was a stone platform covered with scratches. The dried blood on the surface had stained it countless times, even turning the original green stone platform into a purplish red. And on the ground next to it, there was a rotten corpse with its stomach split open. The flesh and skin had long dried up, leaving only a ferocious expression on its face. On the other side, there were more than 10 corpses of the same size piled up into a small hill. The densely packed bones made Akasha shudder. She was not afraid of the corpses, but she suddenly had doubts about the function of the magic tower. These are the corpses of the snow monsters? Asterisk, 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 bang. The snow monster that was climbing on the wall suddenly fell and hit the ground heavily. The back of its head was smashed by the black wood. Because the impact was too heavy, its eyes had been smashed. When it fell to the ground, its limbs twitched a few times and it directly stopped breathing. On the outer wall, the besieging snow monsters were fighting with the soldiers from the kingdom of Karen with their lives. Although each snow monster was huge, in front of the city wall, there was not much resistance at all. The wall was smooth and tidy, making it difficult to climb. The snow monsters struggled to climb up a few meters before they were smashed down. When their more than 400 kilograms bodies fell, they often dragged 3 or 4 of their companions down. The people on the wall only needed to pour oil and throw stones down, and countless snow monsters howled and died. Corpses piled up under the wall, but there was not much joy on the soldiers' faces. The continuous fighting gradually made them feel tired. Even with the reserve troops rotating, such continuous fighting was not something that could be endured by men made of iron. Looking at the irrational snow monsters rushing up, even the most experienced soldiers felt a little scared. These veterans were not afraid of hard battles, but fighting a group of irrational lunatics was really a little scary. If even the battle-hardened elites had such emotions, then the barbarians who had only experienced a few fierce battles were even more unbearable. When the barbarians who cowered in fear were reprimanded by Sodalar, all of their expressions became extremely embarrassed. Both sides did not speak the same language, but the most basic body language was understood by everyone. Sodalar pointed his sword at the bottom of the wall. Even if the barbarians did not have brains, they still knew what he meant. Even so, most of them stood where they were with their heads down, like ostriches with their heads stuck in the sand. Even though they had fought against the snow monsters several times before, the effects of the 10 years of fear of fighting the barbarians could not be dispelled. For most of the barbarians, to be able to stand and not run away was already the result of their hard work. Don't you have brains? If we don't go up now, we'll all be finished when they reach the wall. Damn it. Go up. Don't just stand there like idiots. The scabbard did not have much of an effect on these fellows. Apart from the fellow named Irwin, who seemed to be fighting, the rest of the big guys were looking into the city, as if they were ready to slip away at any time. We can't run. Basler, Gucko, what are you afraid of? Irwin was the strongest in the team, but because he was too young, he did not have much prestige. As a result, his persuasion was also ineffective. He actually did not have any foresight for the current battle. It was purely a battle thirst in his bones. But when he met a group of useless teammates who were not willing to help, Irwin could not help but feel a little annoyed. Damn it, mud can't stick to the wall. He had shouted, scolded, and hit them. Faced with the stubborn barbarians, Sodalar could not be bothered to say anything more. He simply chose to give up. Holding his shield, he turned around and threw himself into the front line of battle. With nowhere to vent the anger in his heart, the snow monsters attacking the city were in big trouble. He stretched out his hand and grabbed a huge log that was being carried by 2 soldiers. With the support of his battle aura, he swung it down the city wall with one hand and smashed 3 or 4 snow monsters into mud. All of you, go to hell! Angry shouts reverberated in the surroundings. 4 or 5 barbarians turned around and left the team, running straight into the inner city. The remaining dozen or so people stayed where they were, hesitating. Irwin, who was wielding his battle axe, spat out a mouthful of saliva as he pointed at his fleeing companions and cursed. He then turned around and rushed to Sodalar's side, swinging his battle axe to split open a nearby snow monster. This unforeseen event was just an interlude in the chaotic situation. The city defense battle, which did not require much skill, lasted for several hours. The attacks of the snow monsters seemed to be gradually weakening because of the soldiers' desperate counterattacks. But after the soldiers rotated the reserves 4 times, 5 to 6 large, demonized snow monsters finally approached the city wall while the front line suffered heavy casualties. Behind them were a few snow monster leaders that were even more muscular than the rest. Lady Merlinsera. Although the slightly hesitant voice was not loud, it was unusually abrupt in the silent palace. Merlinsera's figure paused, but she did not stop moving forward. She knew her current situation very well. There was no possibility for her to stop now. After the dragon crystal lost its effect, all her hopes were placed on the statue in front of her that was emitting energy. This was her last stand. No one could stop her. But Roddy did not seem to be aware of this. After shouting that sentence, he hesitated for a few seconds and continued, "I think it's best not to open that thing in front of us." His voice unconsciously trembled a little. This was normal for Merlinsera. Mortals should have this kind of reverence when facing a dragon. But she did not know that Roddy was nervous not because of her identity, but because of the relief sculptures on the walls of the palace. After entering, Merlinsera went straight to the point. She ran towards the statue of Solomon in the center of the palace. Obviously, she wanted to see what was under the statue. But Roddy did not dare to act rashly. He had accepted a legendary level mission and was very nervous. How could he walk around carelessly? After he stopped in place, he immediately started to observe the surroundings, hoping to find some clues that could help with the mission. For a successful PvE player, the mission was always traceable. After seeing the relief sculptures around him, he immediately knew what this place was. "Lady Merlinsera, I'm not joking. I hope you can listen to what I have to say before you make a decision, okay?" The shadow dragon ignored him and strode towards the statue in the center of the palace. Roddy's eyelids twitched. He felt all the muscles in his body tense up. At this moment, he did not care whether he was polite or not. He said loudly, "If you have time, you can look at the relief sculpture on the third wall on your right." At this point, anyone could hear the anxiety and pleading in Roddy's voice. Merlinsera finally stopped in her tracks. But just when Roddy thought she would look at the relief sculpture, Merlinsera slowly turned around and looked at Roddy with an extremely cold and disgusted gaze. "You have no right to speak here, mortal." The next moment, she raised her fist and punched the statue of Solomon under the bronze canopy. Chapter 433. In the magic tower, Akasha and Natha's footsteps did not stop. A sense of crisis lingered in the hearts of the two. Although the magic tower was quiet at this time, they could not be sure if the battle outside the door and the door would stop. They were not naive enough to think that they were safe now. After experiencing so many trials of life and death, neither of them had any hope in their hearts. At this point, the only thought in their minds was to try to calm down and think of a way out. After staying in this team for a long time, no matter who it was, they would gradually be influenced by the leader. Akasha and Natha's heart had long been rooted in Roddy's calmness at all times. So at this time, there was not much panic on their faces. Instead, they were calmly observing everything around them. At this time, there was basically only one question in their mind. Why was this magic tower built? There's a line of words here. Natha, who was walking on the stairs, pointed to the opposite wall. "Between the pillars." "I see it." Akasha looked over, and then spelled out the words that were casually carved on the stone wall. "I see hope. Test subject number 317 survived for 3 days. There's something there too." "Where?" "This is, damn it, there seems to be something underground." "This is, Arcana theory is wrong, mine is right." The two walked along the spiral stairs to the top of the tower. Along the way, they spelled out the words that seemed to be randomly carved on the walls. Unknowingly, they had entered the upper area. At this moment, the two of them had also found something from the clues. Akasha frowned slightly and whispered, "This tower seems to be used by only one person. Otherwise, he would not randomly write these complaints like graffiti." Natha was not good with words, but she also knew that it was not good to stay silent now. So she also said her conclusion after careful observation: this guy should have stayed here for a long time. She raised her hand and pointed to the top and the base of the tower. Although the words on these two places were written by the same person, the strokes gradually became sloppy in the later stages. It was as if he wrote these things to vent or relieve boredom. The combination of similar inferences probably put together an incomplete puzzle. This magic tower should be an independent area used by a magician, and the purpose seemed to be to study and do some experiments on the snow monsters. The mage's final research seemed to be successful, but he soon encountered an unexpected accident. The reason was because when Akasha and Natha stepped into the top area of the tower, they found a cracked wall and some words. "I can't accept this. I will succeed, and the whole world will tremble under my shadow. Even if he dies, this bastard won't have it easy." Such a result naturally meant that the other party had ended up in failure. Akasha looked back at the ground that was tens of meters away, and then turned her gaze back to the blurry cracks that formed the words in front of her. Suddenly, her gaze became serious, and she reached out to touch the cracks on the wall. She whispered, "These words were created by the use of elemental explosion." Her tone was full of disbelief, followed by a deep sense of awe. Natha held her short bow and was on guard, not understanding the meaning of these words. She was not a mage, so naturally she did not know what was there to be amazed about. But Akasha was different. Although she was a clergyman, she had been in the Viper Cross for a long time, and could be said to be knowledgeable. She was very clear. Using the elemental wind blade to carve words on the stone was basically something that a high-level mage could do. But using the elemental explosion to create words was basically equivalent to using the impact of an explosive arrow to carve tofu. The words, lifting something heavy as if it were light, were used to describe this kind of godly control of the elements. If just carving words had such power, Akasha could not help but feel a little apprehensive. Could it be that the previous owner of this place was also a terrifying person on the same level as Khadgar? The crazy snow monsters outside, the strange elemental creatures, and the clues in front of her combined together, Akasha felt that she seemed to have touched upon a huge secret that had been covered up in history. But she did not have much time to analyze it, because the problem in front of them was unavoidable. Where was their way out? With uncertain expressions, the two finally arrived at the top of the tower. This place did not have the ring-like structure of the other floors, but in the middle, there was a circular magic circle with an area of 100 square meters. After leaving the steps, Natha came to the edge of the magic circle and squinted her eyes to observe the ground. After trying for a long time, she finally confirmed that there were no traps. Akasha also released a few divine spells, and after confirming that there were no traps, she finally stepped into the magic circle. She wanted to go to the core of the stone platform to find clues, but she had only taken a few steps when a light instantly bloomed from under her feet. Buzz. The unique buzzing sound of the magic circle's activation instantly spread throughout the entire tower, and then the entire magic tower began to shake. The sound of the stone building twisting and deforming caused the two to turn pale as they struggled to stabilize themselves. For a moment they did not know what to do, and the only thought in their minds was, if the tower collapsed just like that, they would definitely die. Fortunately, the shaking quickly disappeared, but when Akasha raised her head, she revealed the same shocked expression as Natha. The sudden activation of the magic circle did not cause any harm to the two of them. Instead, it emitted a large amount of blue light. The intersecting beams of light condensed and formed a holographic image in front of the two of them. Akasha looked at it with bated breath. The scaled-down city walls, the fortress, the inner city, the magic tower, and the white palace gradually floated up. If Roddy was here, he would definitely exclaim, because this was a 3D holographic map of the King Solomon's treasure dungeon. But Akasha and Natha did not understand what these buildings meant. They stared blankly in front of them, and after a long while, they heard the little priest exclaim, "Those snow monsters." She pointed at the outer city wall. The wall, which was made of light beams, had shrunk to a height of 1 meter. However, it was not completely empty. Instead, there were figures fighting with all their might, as well as the snow monsters that were trying to break through the city wall. Sodeler's figure with his battle shield was very conspicuous. Akasha looked to the side, and the reserve troops were seizing the time to drink and rest. Erwin, who was swinging his battle axe wildly, kicked away an approaching enemy, and opened his mouth wide to roar. All these images made Akasha instantly understand the function of the magic circle, and a sudden surge of hope rose in her heart. She turned her head and wanted to call Natha, but found that Natha was actually lying low on the ground. "Natha? Roddy is here." The wood elf's voice was filled with indescribable excitement, mixed with emotions, and Akasha inexplicably felt something. But at this time, she did not have time to speak, and rushed to Natha's side to look over. In the palace behind the magic tower, Roddy's figure could be seen at a glance, but the strange thing was that there was a familiar figure not far in front of him. "That's that dragon called Marinsura?" Akasha and Natha looked at each other. Although they still had doubts, at this time, they believed that the content of the magic circle could not be fake. But because of this, they were very surprised. In this world of ice and snow, which was said to be the end of the world, how could they meet dragons? And it was a familiar one? But before they could figure out the connection, Roddy's action in the image made the two gasp. He suddenly raised his short bow and shot an arrow at Marinsura. Whoosh! At the moment when Marinsura was about to shatter the stone statue, Roddy had no choice but to attack. A long arrow instantly flew out, shooting straight at the shadow dragon's arm. Crack! In the next moment, Marinsura's arm shook, and the spinning arrow suddenly stopped in her hand, then was crushed into pieces. Even if the dragon crystal had lost its response, a giant dragon was still a giant dragon, after all. The attribute advantage brought by the difference in level was not something that Roddy could make up for at present. In front of the shadow dragon, Roddy's attack was no threat to it at all. But at this time, Roddy was also suffering unspeakably. The moment the first arrow was shot, he was already mentally prepared for all the consequences that would follow, but the current situation forced him to do something like this to make enemies with the dragons. What is buried under the ground is not treasure. He raised his short bow, but did not forget to shout this sentence. But obviously, Marinsura took this sentence as a provocation, and her face instantly turned extremely gloomy. Dragons had their pride. Although Marinsura was angered, she would not waste her breath. After glancing at Roddy, she directly ignored him, raised her hand, and blasted at Solomon's statue again. In her eyes, finding the treasure was her top priority. This caused Roddy, who was holding the short bow, to completely miscalculate. In a moment of desperation, he gritted his teeth and continued to shoot 2 more arrows. At the same time, he leaped forward frantically, threw away the short bow in his hand, and picked up the battle axe on his back. Stop! Since he started to stop Marinsura, this was the 3rd time that Roddy had shouted a warning, but all he got in return was a palm strike from the other party. Get lost. Regardless of whether Roddy had saved her before or not, Marinsura had completely erased all positive impressions of him. If he dared to attack the dragons, the only outcome left for him was death. As for Roddy's words, Marinsura did not take it seriously at all. The arrow was knocked away, and the battle axe was slapped away. Facing this human who pulled out his short sword and tried to attack her again, Marinsura finally lost her patience. She slapped Roddy away, and then finally got her wish and punched the statue. Roddy, who was sent flying, fell to the ground with a thud. The arm he used to block the attack was almost broken, but at this moment, he could not care less about the pain in his body. Instead, he tried his best to support his body, and widened his eyes as he stared at the shattered statue of Solomon. The arrogant Solomon was shattered into pieces, and at the same time, an oppressive aura suddenly gushed out, making Marinsura feel suffocated. Even though Marinsura was a powerful dragon who had lived in seclusion for many years, she still lost her composure at this moment. She wanted to retreat, but her body froze on the spot. Her pretty face was filled with horror, as if she had completely forgotten that she was a noble dragon who controlled the lives and deaths of others just a few seconds ago. It's too late. It's still too late. On the other side, Roddy, who had been completely suppressed by the terrifying aura of the tomb, swallowed hard. His gaze gradually turned to the relief depicting the construction of the palace. In the relief, there was a huge snow monster that was more than 100 meters tall below the palace. Chapter 434. The reliefs in the palace were scattered all over the place. Upon closer inspection, one would notice that 3 of them were slightly larger than the others. In terms of position, these 3 reliefs, which were almost 10 meters tall, were right in front of the original statue of Solomon. The content of the reliefs was easy to understand. In the first relief, Solomon was fighting a huge snow monster with a staff. In the second relief, he killed the monster and buried its corpse. In the center of the third relief, the White Palace was built on top of the snow monster's corpse. This was clearly the proudest achievement of Solomon's life. Some areas in the picture were drawn with sparkling ice crystals, and the words Seal Baranchalu were written in the High Elves' language. Roddy didn't think much of the content at first, but when he saw the words Baranchalu, he realized the seriousness of the matter. When the seal was broken, the monstrous aura of a demigod rushed out, and the entire palace seemed to tremble. Roddy had never thought that he would be unable to stand because of an invisible aura. However, at that moment, he had to admit that even the arrogant dragon in front of him trembled in fear and almost collapsed. Merlin Sala took a few steps back, her face as pale as a sheet, and only then did she breathe a sigh of relief. However, before she could even react to what she had released, several large cracks appeared on the base of the broken stone statue. Their attacks have slowed down. Everyone, save your strength. At the same time, Sodalar shouted an order to the soldiers beside him. He then lifted his leg and kicked a boulder off the city wall. The snow monster that was climbing below couldn't dodge in time and was slapped in the face. It wailed and fell. Compared to the previous critical situation, the pressure on the city wall had been greatly reduced. The appearance of the demonized snow monsters and the few bosses almost caused the defense line to collapse. Fortunately, they didn't know any siege skills. In the end, they only managed to tear down part of the wall before they were smashed by the endless defensive equipment. But the group of veterans had fought with their lives on the line until now, and their stamina was finally starting to run out. Fortunately, their efforts showed result. After several hours of attacking the city, these monsters finally had a sense of fear. Their crazy spirit had weakened, and at this time, only a few who were not afraid of death were still climbing up. Bring the food up. Those who are exhausted, report in advance. Take off the useless armor. Don't waste any energy you can. Sodalar patrolled around. Seeing that the soldiers had regained the initiative, he had his subordinates take his place. He took a few steps back and drank a few mouthfuls of water. Then, he narrowed his eyes. Surprisingly, there were a few tall barbarians on the front line. Only 5 of the previously hesitant barbarians chose to pick up their weapons and join the front line in the end. However, most of the barbarians chose to flee. In this way, there were only 6 barbarians who stayed behind to continue fighting. The other 14 had already run into the inner city and disappeared without a trace. Sodeler was furious, but he knew that this was unavoidable. After catching his breath for a moment, he got up and prepared to arrange for the reserve team to rotate. But before he took 2 steps, a sweeping aura made his hair stand on end, and he shivered all over. The other soldiers' movements also paused for a moment at the same time, and even Erwin almost threw away his axe because of this pause. Before the soldiers could turn around to look, a series of roars sounded from below the city wall again. In the next instant, the snow monsters that had originally retreated rushed over with bloodshot eyes. Their bodies expanded by more than 30% as if they had cast the bloodlust spell. Their strength and explosive power almost doubled. The snow monster at the front sprinted and jumped more than 6 meters high, clinging to the middle of the city wall. It looked like it would only take a few steps to flip over the wall. Not good. Sodeler's expression changed. He immediately realized that the city wall was probably going to fall. But the words "retreat" were at the tip of his tongue. That was because the plan Roddy had written for him clearly stated that there were several traps and mechanisms in the city that could not be approached, and it had been emphasized countless times that, "do not trespass into the inner city." For the past 2 years, Roddy had not made a single wrong decision, and Sodeler had always carried out Roddy's will accurately. But now that things had come to this, he could no longer be a mission executor who stuck to old conventions. Gripping his blood-stained longsword tightly, Sodeler pulled David, who was about to rush up, and shouted, "Take the reserve team and retreat from the small path to the west. Stop in front of the 3rd house from the right and wait for me to advance. Team 2, retreat, Otto. Take those big fools and retreat with you. Team 3, retreat. We give up the outer city wall. Light this place up." The 50 or so people were stunned at first, but then they started to carry out the order without any nonsense. They cooperated well and did not panic as they retreated. The soldiers who brought up the rear scattered the remaining grease on the ground and lit it up along with the black logs. Flames soared into the sky, and the snow monsters that had just climbed up were immediately burned to the point of wailing. Then there was a dull thud of heavy objects falling to the ground. Sodeler retreated with the last team. When they arrived at the previously planned rendezvous point, he immediately rushed to the front of the team and led them through the complicated paths in the outer city. His actions made the soldiers look at each other in dismay. Logically speaking, they should have retreated to the inner city and organized a defense on the inner city wall. When they looked back, they found that the burning walls were already filled with the silhouettes of snow monsters, and when they looked forward, Sodeler was still leading them left and right without any idea what was going on. Boom! The sound of a demonic snow monster crashing into a stone wall could be heard. Its eyes were bloodshot as it ran wildly, instantly smashing through several walls and catching up to the rear of the team. On the city wall, they could use the terrain to defend, but on flat ground, this terrifying 4.5-meter-tall monster was really hard to resist. A single punch from it would probably turn anyone into meat paste. Don't look back. Run with me. As soon as Sodeler's voice fell, the demonic snow monster behind them smashed through the beam of a stone house and roared as it rushed over from the empty space the team had just bypassed. But just when the soldiers thought that a battle was inevitable, a large amount of blood suddenly sprayed out. Countless blue pillars of light suddenly shot up from the seemingly normal ground. When they looked carefully, they found that the empty space was actually filled with huge ice cones that were more than 3 meters long. Under such an attack, the demonic snow monster and the ones behind it were instantly turned into sieves. Sodeler, who was running at the front, finally heaved a sigh of relief. His eyes flashed, and with a wave of his hand, he led the team to the next trap, while Sodeler and the others were fleeing in panic. Akasha stood in the center of the huge magic formation of the magic tower, her hands pressed on the core sphere, and her brows furrowed as she poured out magic power. The sudden appearance of the magic formation made them understand the current situation of the battle, but it still could not solve the current crisis. In a moment of desperation, Akasha had to choose to touch the core of the magic formation. She was not trying to do it randomly. Because she had come into contact with Elson's defense system, she judged that this magic formation should have a similar defensive function. But her attempts still failed. The magic power to cast divine spells could not be activated, and the power of the dead to summon the undead also did not work. Akasha racked her brains and compressed the magic power according to the method in the book, the essence of energy. Even after purifying the power of the dead, she still did not succeed, and just when she was in despair, the elemental energy that she inadvertently tried to imitate suddenly caused a change in the magic formation. Akasha's face lit up, and her eyes looked to the side of the magic formation. In the projection, the elemental creatures that were fighting with the snow monsters outside the magic tower suddenly stopped, and then began to concentrate on killing the demonic snow monsters as if they were under control. Beside her, Natha frowned, but before she could say anything, she saw Akasha raise her arm. Following her movements, a large number of fireballs and icicles condensed on the base of the demonic tower. With a whoosh, they streaked across the air and fell into the group of snow monsters like raindrops, instantly exploding into a sea of blood. "I can control this magic tower," Akasha shouted excitedly, but then her face turned pale, and she almost fell to the ground. She immediately took out a bottle of magic potion and drank it, saying hurriedly, "Hurry up and save them, I can't hold on much longer." Natha looked around. At this time, Roddy and Marinsura were still surrounded in the White Palace, and none of the snow monsters outside could break in. On the other side, Sodalar was being chased by the snow monsters, and was trying to get closer to the inner city. With a decision in her heart, she pursed her lips, picked up her longbow, and ran down. Bang! Inside the palace, Marinsura, who was trying to get close to the seal, was sent flying for the third time. When she fell to the ground, her expression was extremely ugly, and it took a lot of effort for her to even stand up. Roddy frowned at this scene, but he still didn't move. Although the other party had beaten him up quite badly, it was clearly not the time to gloat over his misfortune. In the face of the word life and death, these things were nothing. At this moment there was undisguised despair in Roddy's heart, because no matter how he looked at it, the level, skills, and equipment that he was so proud of from any perspective were nothing in front of a demigod. The other party's aura had not yet broken through the seal, but he was already suppressed to the point that he couldn't even stand up. Even when he was at the peak of level 59, Roddy had never encountered such a strong enemy. He looked at the seal that was gradually breaking, and his heart was in a mess of emotions. But as he suddenly clenched his fists, he suppressed the despair in his heart. The more despair he felt, the stronger his desire to live became. Roddy's gaze swept across the quest pane, and he quickly thought about all the information about this dungeon. The outer city wall, the magic tower, the White Palace, the snow monster, Baranchalu, Solomon, the strange seal, and those relief sculptures. Suddenly, Roddy looked at the relief sculptures in the distance again, and after frowning slightly, he suddenly shouted at Marinsura, who was about to get close to the seal again. "Hey! Do you know about spell formations? I might know how to solve it." The Shadow Dragon's figure froze on the spot because of this sentence. Although she didn't want to admit it, Marinsura had to face the fact that she had just done something wrong. She shouldn't have been so arrogant as to think that she was in control of everything, and even more so, she shouldn't have broken the seal so recklessly. But what was done could not be undone. Not to mention the regret in her heart, Roddy's question tortured her even more. When had dragons ever been ordered around like this? But now, facing a demigod who was about to break through the seal, she had to admit that she was useless. Hearing Roddy's words, she gritted her teeth, and her pretty face almost distorted in anger. But after a few seconds she still admitted defeat and said, "According to human standards, I am a magus. That should be enough." Chapter 435. Rhodey's pretentious attitude made Marinsara very unhappy, but she really had no reason to be angry. The aura erupting from the seal was getting stronger and stronger, and if she didn't find a solution, even an idiot knew what would happen to her next. "Do you see the relief sculpture over there?" Roddy didn't have time to explain. He raised his hand and pointed into the distance. He stared at Marinsara and shouted under the overwhelming pressure, "The third one in the middle, the one that looks empty. What are you trying to say?" Marinsara frowned, but she didn't turn around to look. She had already seen it, so she didn't think it would be of any use if she looked at it a few more times. "Since you're a magician, can you tell if the city depicted on the map is related to magic?" "What?" Marinsara was stumped by this question, but dragons weren't idiots, after all. She raised an eyebrow as a thought suddenly occurred to her, and she abruptly turned around. The relief sculpture was still the same white marble, and the pattern depicted on it was the same as before. But when Marinsara looked at it, she immediately felt that something was wrong. All the previous relief carvings had basically filled up the entire stone slab, but this relief carving only had the outline of the city in the center. The carvings were exquisite, and the white space around the picture was a full 60%. At first glance, Roddy thought that Solomon was showing off his achievements, but after thinking about it carefully, he realized that there must be a reason behind it. The reason why he focused on this was because of his past experience in the Instance dungeons. In Earthbreaker, no matter how difficult the Instance dungeon was or how powerful the boss was, it was ultimately for the players with limited levels to clear it. What if the Instance dungeon boss was too powerful? Then the Instance dungeon would often provide the players with some assistance to complete the kill. But this assistance wasn't something that could be easily found. The players had to find and activate it themselves. Roddy was well versed in this, so he immediately identified the most suspicious relief sculpture in the hall as the target and made a judgment. Roddy didn't understand the specific principles of magic, which was why he made this request to Marinsara. The Shadow Dragon was indeed an expert. After she had enough hints in her mind, she quickly identified the things hidden under the repetitive lines. "This is an overlapping formation?" Marinsara murmured softly before opening her mouth slightly. Even as a member of the dragons, she had never seen such a large scale in her life. Usually, the magic circle only occupied an area of a few square meters to dozens of square meters. Even the magic circle used in the city was just a series of large magic circles connected one by one. However, the formation in front of him, just the surface area of the formation alone, was more than 10 square kilometers. In other words, the entire King Solomon's Treasure Instance dungeon was a part of the magic circle. In Marinsara's eyes, the outer city walls, the inner city walls, the magic tower, and even the inconspicuous floor tiles outside the White Palace were all part of the magic circle. At the same time, there wasn't just one, but two clearly layered magic circles. One of them was a typical ceiling magic circle. From the layout to the structure of the Mageweth, Marinsara could recognize it clearly. It must have been this activated magic circle that had sealed Baranchalu for hundreds of years. The other magic circle that was nested and overlapped was quite mysterious. Marinsara could vaguely confirm that it was also a magic circle with the same sealing effect from the pattern of the formation, but it was larger and more powerful. When she thought of the person who built this city, Marinsara's heart was suddenly filled with hope. Solomon was considered powerful even in the records of the dragons. As a wizard who could make the proud dragons look at him, how could he not have a backup plan when dealing with Baranchalu? With this in mind, all the clues seemed to be completely clear. After many deductions appeared in her mind, Marinsara suddenly understood everything. She couldn't help but say, Solomon already knew that the seal would break, so he prepared an even more powerful sealing magic circle here. She stared at the relief sculpture and her words became more certain. As long as this magic circle is activated, we can seal this guy again. Roddy was stunned when he heard this. Then, he thought of another question. So these 3 instance dungeons are connected. Only by activating them at the same time can we complete the legendary mission? However, before he could think further, Merlinsera's cursing interrupted him. Damn it! This magic circle actually needs energy to activate. How do we activate it? What energy do we need? Magic crystal? Roddy didn't waste time and asked the question directly. The shadow dragon didn't care about her identity anymore. She pointed at a small groove on the ground in front of the seal and said, "The main energy of this magic circle is underground. However, to activate the energy, we need to embed a high-grade magic crystal here. At the same time, we need to open the 3 external links." What links? Where is it? It's outside this palace, at the position of those 3 circles. Roddy looked in that direction and quickly found the 3 circular marks outside the White Palace. Obviously, if they wanted to open these things, they had to go out. But there are snow monsters outside. I know. But that's not the point. The point is that we don't have a high-grade magic crystal right now. Can you conjure one for me? Merlinsera's voice was flustered and exasperated. She finally saw hope, but now she was in despair because she didn't have enough resources. Even the dragons couldn't stay calm. However, as soon as she finished speaking, Roddy reached into his pocket and took something out. Then, take a look. Does this work? In his hand was the extreme water essence that he had always kept close to his body. Merlinsera's expression changed several times. She didn't think that she would have something to do with this insignificant mortal every time she escaped from danger. However, things had already come to this. She sighed in resignation and retreated a few steps to stand in front of Roddy. She picked up the water essence and looked at it. There's enough energy, but it's not that easy to activate the array. Merlinsera didn't have time to waste. She quickly said, "According to the array on the map, I have to go out and open 3 nodes. However, if I want to go out, I have to close the barrier around the palace gate. So, you have to ensure that when I open all the nodes, the core of the array is still stable." Her voice became low. "Can you do that?" "I have to close the barrier." Roddy raised his eyebrows. This meant that the palace would lose its protection, and all the snow monsters would be able to rush in without any hindrance. This barrier is a part of the array. If you want to activate the array, you have to close the barrier. I don't know why Solomon did this, but it is indeed constructed this way. Although Roddy was suspicious of Solomon's motives, he knew that Merlinsera didn't need to panic. Thus, he immediately nodded in agreement. Merlinsera immediately reached out and pulled him up from the ground. The 2 of them who were fighting a moment ago looked at each other with indescribable emotions in their hearts. The shadow dragon who let go of Roddy felt indescribably depressed. If it wasn't for the fact that she had lost all her magic power, she wouldn't have touched a mortal in the first place. Click. The crack in the seal deepened again, leaving Merlinsera with no time to think. After Roddy inserted the water essence into the seal, she rushed to the palace gate and took a deep breath. She raised her hand and changed the magewebs on the stone pillars on both sides. Then, she closed the protective barrier around the gate and activated the second large array that Solomon had left behind. Buzz! The enchantment in front of the palace gate instantly disappeared, and the blue mageweb instantly appeared on the floor, spreading from the core of the water essence. At the same time, the roar of the snow monster outside the door rumbled like a tsunami. "It's up to you now, mortal." Merlinsera threw down this sentence and raised her hand to blow away a snow monster that was approaching her. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared into the swarm of snow monsters. Meanwhile, Roddy stood alone not far from the seal. He looked at the enemies that were rushing in and slowly raised his short bow. Boom! At the same time, the sound of a fireball exploding resounded in the outer city wall dungeon. Amidst the smoke and dust that filled the sky, a group of soldiers ran out of the smoke and dust. Each of them looked to be in a sorry state. Turn right and stop in front of the second pillar. Then turn left. Soddler's order was followed by the soldiers one by one. Big Idiot Elson and his 5 companions followed closely behind. Because he was tall, he looked back from time to time to see what was happening behind him. The snow monsters that were chasing after them were either killed by inexplicable fireballs or icicles, or suddenly fell into bottomless pits. Erwin knew very well that the reason there were no casualties until now was because of Soddler's guidance. If he hadn't used these traps to delay the demonized snow monsters, it would have been a miracle if only 5 of them were still alive. These traps appeared without warning. Not only did they kill dozens of snow monsters, but Erwin also saw the corpses of many barbarians who had run away in fear. Needless to say, these cowardly barbarians did not have the ability to foresee the future. They all died in the traps. However, the death of his people did not affect Erwin much at this time. After a long battle, not only was his body tired, even his brain had become dull. He did not know how many turns he had taken and how many snow monsters he had shaken off. When his vision began to blur, Erwin suddenly realized that the soldiers in front of him had stopped in their tracks. He looked up and saw that a huge city gate had suddenly appeared in front of him. It was like a mountain in front of everyone. Soddler's face was pale as he looked up at the gate. The despair in his eyes was quickly replaced by determination. In Roddy's plan, this sealed gate meant the end of the outer city wall. Chapter 436. As Soddler led his team back to fight to the death, Akasha, who was on the top floor of the magic tower, was anxiously controlling the core. She stared unblinkingly at the blue figure that represented Natha in the light screen. In the light screen, the petite wood elf was running across the chaotic battlefield. Although the number of snow monsters outside the magic tower was decreasing, this empty space was definitely not suitable for crossing. The elemental creatures were previously weak and overwhelmed by the snow monsters. Now, with the support of the magic tower's firepower, they gradually turned the situation around. But because of this area was even more dangerous. No matter how fast Natha was, she was still sent flying several times by the shockwaves that exploded in all directions. There was no system to distinguish between friend and foe here. Although the Balrog was under her command, it couldn't control its blazing heat and the fireballs that it released with a wave of its hand. The fireballs and ice arrows that flew over her head were more like catapults with no precision. Several times they almost hit Natha. This couldn't be helped. She wasn't an elemental sorcerer, and the way she controlled the magic circle was extremely inefficient. Right now, suppressing the attacks of the snow monsters was already the limit of what she could do. Natha also knew this, so even though she was covered in cuts and bruises, she didn't complain at all. After rushing past the front line formed by the elemental creatures, she looked past the countless snow monsters and stared straight at the lever that could open the inner city gate. If she wanted to rescue Soddler, she had to open this gate. But just like Soddler and the others, she couldn't fight against those cruel and bloodthirsty snow monsters. Arrows kept shooting out. Because she didn't have a high headshot rate like Roddy, she could only try her best to remember what Roddy had taught her. She used all the terrain and even the unintentional formation of the enemy to plan her route. As for where she could rush to, she didn't even think about it. There was only one belief that supported her to rush here alone. In order to save Roddy, she needed the help of Soddler and the others. With just her and Akasha, they would not be able to do anything. At this moment, Akasha, who was the only one who could see the entire situation, had her heart in her throat. She gulped down the last bottle of mana potion, and was trying her best to hold back the burning sensation in her chest when she suddenly saw a flash of light from the other side of the palace. The little priest glanced over and immediately saw Merlinsera, who was blasting away the snow monsters outside the palace. When she shifted her gaze, she felt as if she was struck by lightning when she saw Roddy. ********************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************************* The head of the snow monster, which was the same size as the head of a polar bear, exploded. The light of Arcana Blast on Roddy's wristband splashed the brains far away. Before the corpse fell to the ground, Roddy suddenly took a step back and brandished his battle axe and short sword at the same time, using brute force to hack away the arms of the other two snow monsters that approached him. It had been 2 minutes since Merlin Sarah rushed out, but during this time, every second felt like a year for Roddy. He couldn't dodge, he couldn't fight back, and he couldn't retreat recklessly. In order to protect the water essence, he had to stand still and resist the attacks of the snow monsters. Roddy's class disadvantage was completely exposed at this moment. If he had changed his class to Guardian with full plate armor, he would probably be able to resist for 15 minutes, but there were no ifs in this world. Even if Roddy had countless ways to escape, he could only fight with his life at the moment. And the reason why he hadn't fallen yet was that the level of the snow monsters that approached first was too low. As the high-level snow monsters kept surging in from behind, Roddy was sure that he wouldn't be able to hold on for long. He had used all the skills he could use. The Ring of Pardon and other magic tools were on cooldown, the Arcana shield in his belt and chest armor had been shattered, and the 3 bottles of high-level potions had been emptied, but the attacks of the snow monsters were getting more and more intense. Were the dragons that he had only met twice trustworthy? Were the dragons recorded in the books reliable? In this desperate situation, Roddy's willpower began to waver, and he even began to doubt whether he should trust Merlin Sarah. But in that instant, the cruelty of reality mercilessly taught him a lesson. His leather armor was slashed open by the sharp claws, and blood sprayed all over the ground. His back was hit hard, and his shoulder blade was fractured on the spot. His short sword was stuck in the muscle of a snow monster's upper arm, and it was pulled away by the snow monster with brute force. Then, his left arm was smashed off. After taking several heavy blows, half of his body completely lost feeling. In just 3 seconds, Roddy was almost torn to shreds by the violent snow monsters. He swung his axe with all his might, but he was slapped away by a demonic snow monster that had finally gotten close. The difference in strength was obvious, and Roddy crashed into the seal of Baranchalu like a kite with a broken string. Crack! The axe flew out of his hand, and his body cracked the base of the stone sculpture. Roddy endured the pain, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a huge shadow slowly appearing in the middle of the palace, white fur, long horns that were spiral like a goat's, and a muscular body that was like a mountain pressed down on Roddy like a mountain. The shadow's face, which was 80% similar to the snow monster's, was expressionless, but the sharp teeth that protruded from its mouth revealed an indescribable hostility. With just one glance, Roddy was sure that this was the target of the legendary mission, Baranchalu. The snow monsters stopped in their tracks and prostrated themselves before the king of snow monsters. The respect in their bloodline made them choose to be absolutely obedient. This was the reason why the water essence was not destroyed on the spot. The demigod that had just awakened slowly opened his eyes, and his golden pupils carried a powerful aura that enveloped the entire palace. Ha! The demigod's face revealed a mocking smile. With just a casual glance at Roddy, he felt as if his body was being roasted by fire, and it was extremely painful. In the next moment, Baranchalu casually waved his hand, and the mountain-like pressure instantly caused Roddy's face to turn pale. He understood that if the demigod's attack hit him, even if he was 10 times stronger, he would still die. But just as the dust was about to settle, Baranchalu's expression, that seemed like a smile but yet not a smile, suddenly changed. Immediately after, he abruptly stopped moving and looked up at the roof. Pah! The water essence that Roddy had risked his life to protect shattered without any warning. This movement was inconspicuous among the hundreds of snow monsters, but the subsequent chain reaction that followed made Roddy, who had already lost half his life, dumbfounded. The floor of the palace began to emit a blinding white light, and the air was followed by countless explosions, Rhodey wanted to open his eyes to observe, but because of the dazzling light, he had no choice but to shut his eyes tightly. He could only hear the crackling sound of something crashing into his ears, and his body was gradually covered by a cold layer of ice. At the same time, Baranchula's anguished wails echoed throughout the palace. 100 meters away from the palace, Marinsula, who was covered in blood, raised her head to look at the sky. The giant elemental barrier that kept the 3 dungeons in a mild climate had suddenly shattered. It was not an exaggeration to describe this scene as the heavens and the earth. The blue sky shattered in the light, and after countless runes were annihilated, the blinding sunlight of the glacial plain and the chilly wind engulfed everything. As the temperature plummeted, thousands of frost arrows rained down from the sky, causing Marinsula's expression to change drastically. However, after she prepared her defenses, she discovered that none of the attacks that rained down like a storm had landed on her. The snow monsters surrounding her were all impaled, and they fell to the ground with blood dripping from their bodies. The light gradually faded, but Marinsula's face didn't show the slightest hint of joy. She staggered away from the bodies of the snow monsters, and with a tense expression, she strode toward the White Palace. At the same time, the snow monsters outside the outer city walls and the magic tower were also completely annihilated by the terrifying frost arrows. This sudden attack was so sudden that even Sodalar, who was raising his shield to defend himself, couldn't react in time. Gah! The sound of the inner city gate opening gave the soldiers in the rear a fright. They turned around and saw Natha lying in the shadow of the gate, her entire body paralyzed. She was surrounded by more than 10 ferocious-looking snow monsters. If it weren't for the sudden frost arrows, this wood elf would probably have died here. The opening of the inner city gate meant that the outer city walls and the magic tower dungeon were now connected. Without a word, Sodalar waved his hand and led the troops into the inner city. Natha, who had finally succeeded, had a face full of blood. She forced herself to point at the magic tower and said, "It's safe there. Akasha is controlling it. We still have to save Roddy." Before she could finish her sentence, she fainted due to excessive blood loss. This wood elf really didn't forget her original goal even when she was on the verge of death. Sodalar grasped the key information in her words and immediately determined that Akasha was the key to solving the problem. He immediately led the injured troops into the magic tower. Akasha had already predicted this and rushed to the bottom of the tower. She used a few bottles of healing potions and recovery to stabilize the injuries of Natha and the injured. Seeing that the troops were temporarily stabilized, Sodalar, who was overlooking the ice crystal vein, snapped out of his deep thought and turned to ask, "Where's Roddy?" Crack crack. Merlin Sarah walked into the palace with a tense expression on her face as she stepped on the shattered ice. The bodies of the snow monsters almost occupied her entire vision, and the broken seal in the distance showed the origin of the aura. The shadow dragon sucked in a breath with lingering fear. It knew in its heart that if Roddy hadn't pointed out the magic formation on the relief, if he hadn't bought it 3 minutes, it wouldn't have been able to keep its life. After all, he was a demigod. As a member of the dragon race, she could look down on mortals, and she could even treat the snow monsters as ignorant beasts. However, when it came to the concept of demigod, everything had to be overturned. Demigods were powerful existences with immortal souls. It was not a realm that could be reached with pure physical strength. Even the experts of the dragon race had to treat them with caution. They might even avoid them in order to avoid conflict. In other words, Merlinsula's life was saved by Roddy again. The word again made her purse her lips slightly. She swept her gaze forward, and when she finally found that figure, her heart tightened. Roddy's body was half buried in the shattered ice shards of the frost arrow. His arm was dangling at an awkward angle due to the fracture, and blood was slowly dripping from his fingers onto the ground. Could it be that I'm too late? The shadow dragon's pupils shrank, and she began to jog. Chapter 437. It had been many years since Merlin Sarah last experienced such a fluctuation in her emotions. At that time, the shadow dragons were surrounded and annihilated by other dragons. The sight of her siblings and even her parents dying almost caused her to have a mental breakdown. The loss and pain of losing everyone she could rely on caused irreparable damage to her. The ensuing escape and pursuit made Merlin Sarah mature rapidly, but at the same time, her mentality gradually deformed. After a few years, the once lively and cheerful girl of the dragons had now become suspicious and vigilant of everything. Her heart was as cold as a block of Arctic ice. However, looking at the figure lying in the ice, she could no longer maintain her indifference. As Merlin Sarah approached the broken seal, her mind was filled with an indescribable panic. This was the second time Rhodey had saved her life. She could choose to respond in the same way as before, agree to a simple request from him, return the favor, and then walk away. This was what the dragons had always done. But Merlin Sarah didn't think about this at all. She gritted her teeth and pushed away the corpse of the snow monster in front of her. She used her bare hands to dig away the ice covering Roddy. Seeing that Roddy still didn't respond, she quickly slapped his face hard. "Wake up! Hey!" Merlin Sarah was filled with regret. If she was stronger, perhaps he wouldn't have been so badly injured, but there weren't that many ifs in the world. Due to the consecutive heavy blows, Roddy was now on the verge of death. His spine was broken and his entire body was paralyzed. Although there weren't any open wounds on his body, his internal organs were severely injured. If he didn't receive treatment, his organs would fail and he would die sooner or later. Merlin Sarah didn't have any magic power after losing her dragon crystal. She couldn't even release the lowest level, Shadow Flame, let alone save him. So, she could only watch as Roddy's breathing became weaker and weaker. To be honest, she hadn't trusted anyone in all these years of escaping. But just a few minutes ago, she completely trusted her back to Roddy. Trust, this feeling, which she hadn't experienced for a long time, made Merlin Sarah's heart feel unusually warm. But this warmth was fleeting. She couldn't stop Roddy from walking into the abyss of death. "Wake up, hurry up!" She had never interacted with humans before, and she couldn't control the strength of her slaps due to the urgency in her heart. After slapping his face a few times, Roddy's tightly shut eyes twitched slightly, and he was woken up by the pain. But this kind of awakening was almost like the final radiance of the setting sun. The 4% value on the health points also proved this point. When Roddy opened his eyes, he was still a little dazed. His vision was filled with all kinds of colors, so he did not realize that there was someone in front of him. When Roddy recalled his situation, he immediately squinted his eyes, trying to focus his gaze straight ahead. At the same time, his lips trembled as he opened the character status bar and combat info. After his spine was broken, he couldn't even move his lips when he spoke. Merlin Sarah thought that Roddy wanted to say his last words, so she immediately held her breath and put a hand behind his neck. She moved her face close to his and said, "Hang in there. Don't move." Halfway through her words, she realized that she couldn't save Roddy. After a slight sigh, she finally said, "What other wishes do you have? I swear in the name of the dragon god, I will fulfill them for you." Although she didn't know what the future held, this was all she could do for now. A promise made by the dragon god had to be fulfilled. Even among the dragons, very few would make such a solemn vow. However, Merlin Sarah didn't know that Roddy had temporarily lost his hearing due to the concussion and the continuous energy blast. So, he couldn't hear anything at all. Not only his hearing, but the world in Roddy's eyes was no different from a mosaic. Even the interface in front of him could only be determined by memory. A large number of words appeared in the combat log. Based on the style, Roddy thought that this was the experience points that the snow monsters gave him after they died. After confirming this, he turned to look at the experience points above the basic level. The long string of blurry numbers and the level up button made him heave a sigh of relief. His life was saved. Roddy was really scared. If it wasn't for the experience points that were enough for him to level up once, he would have really died here. It was normal for people to have messy thoughts when they were reborn. It was only at this moment that Roddy realized what was most important in his heart. The female Duke Sally's pleasant face, the little priest Akasha's gentle and submissive demeanor. It was rare for him to look straight into his heart. Now that he thought about it, he realized that he had only been focusing on moving forward for the past year, and had inadvertently neglected many more important things. Thinking about how he had always been constrained in his feelings, Roddy sighed. He then remembered the nagging words of his parents, "You should find a partner. When can I arrange a blind date for you? Your classmates' children are all good at playing around," and so on. He used to scoff at such nagging words, but now that he thought about it, his parents' urging was another form of concern for him. It was also the traditional Chinese belief that carrying on the family line is the most important. The dizziness after the concussion made Roddy a little dazed. He closed his eyes and mumbled unconsciously, "Is it time to have a child?" This was something he had never considered before, because neither he nor Sally and Akasha had reached the step of being honest with each other. Perhaps it was the nagging of his parents in his distant memory, or the fear of death in his heart, but Roddy couldn't help but have similar thoughts. It was an unintentional remark, and Roddy even quickly categorized it as a random thought in his mind, but Marinsara, who had leaned closer to listen to his last words, took it seriously. Want a child?" The shadow dragon's expression instantly distorted, and she almost strangled Roddy on the spot. Her originally pale face immediately turned red. Perhaps it was because of her sullen anger, but most of it was because of the oath she had just made. The dragon god's oath was never a joke. Marinsara clenched her teeth, and a troubled expression appeared on her face. What should I do?" Roddy still didn't realize that there was someone beside him. His spine was broken, and he couldn't feel his entire body, so he quickly chose to level up before his HP completely disappeared. A familiar light flashed, and his body began to repair itself. His senses gradually recovered, and the cold temperature made Roddy shiver. The scenery in front of him gradually became clear, and the sharp pain disappeared. His dislocated limbs made a cracking sound as they returned to their original state. Then, Roddy saw Marinsara in his field of vision, who had her back to him. Roddy, who didn't know what had just happened, was full of HP, and the ice shards that covered his body when he got up fell to the ground. He wiped the blood off his face as if nothing had happened, and looked around at the bodies of the snow monsters. When he saw Marinsara beside him, he said, "It seems that I was right. Solomon had a backup plan. If it weren't for this spell formation, we would have been in deep trouble today." When he turned around, Roddy realized that the atmosphere wasn't right, because Marinsara was looking at him with a strange expression. He knew that it was hard to explain something like full of HP, but he had no other choice. He could only find an excuse. But before he could say anything, he realized that things weren't that simple. Because Marinsara had come directly to him. Then, she raised her fist and punched him in the chest. "You asshole!" Roddy was completely frightened, but then he realized that Marinsara didn't intend to kill him. The punch wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. After all, Marinsara was a little angry out of humiliation. She immediately made Roddy sit on the ground, grimacing in pain. Thinking of the solution that he had thought of, this arrogant shadow dragons had never thought that he would be teased like this. "Is there some misunderstanding between us?" Don't hit me. Lady Marinsara. I don't think we have a deep grudge against each other, right?" Knowing that Marinsara was a dragon's, Roddy didn't dare to hit back. He only felt that it was more like an annoyed commissary in charge of studies who was teaching a bad student a lesson. It seemed more like he was venting his anger. Fortunately, Marinsura quickly regained her composure. She took a deep breath and asked, Did you hear what I said before you recovered? After such a battle, the distance between them had disappeared. Even Marinsura didn't notice the change in her tone. Rhodey shook his head and replied, You also saw it. Just now, my spine was broken and I could not hear anything. I could not see anything in front of me. Before I used my skill, I did not know you were here. What did you say just now? You're lucky. Women didn't need a reason to change the topic. Marinsura's casual words ended Roddy's doubt. She then leaned against the seal and didn't say another word. Although she was angry, she didn't feel much anger after understanding what had happened. Instead, the fact that Roddy was still alive made Marinsura feel happy for no reason. Her heart also seemed to be rejuvenated. Her gloomy life seemed to suddenly have a hint of light. Unknowingly, the corners of her mouth that were always tense had begun to curve upwards. Hiss! Roddy rubbed his chest and stood up again. Lady Marinsura. Call me Marinsura. Marinsura, I think the dragons don't lack treasures, right? Why did you take such a big risk to come here? Roddy was actually quite emotional. When he first met her in the silent forest, he could only lower his head and ask for her help. But now, he could actually call her by her name. Chapter 438. If I die here, then the shadow dragons will be erased from the dragon's lineage. Marinsura's expression darkened. The joy of escaping death faded away after hearing those words. But after venting out the resentment that she had accumulated for a long time, she felt a lot more relaxed. Roddy didn't notice the change in Marinsura's attitude because he was completely stunned by her words. Even the dragons could be massacred? This was beyond common sense. Could it be that Marinsura had some kind of treasure that the dragons would be so ruthless to her? I escaped from the lair alone, and then I was constantly being hunted down. You must have seen it last time in the silent forest. There was no end to them until a few days ago, when I killed another one in the mountains to the south. When I saw the glacial plains, I remembered a book I once read. It said that there was a powerful treasure here. I felt that this might be my only hope. If it wasn't for the fact that I had no other choice, I wouldn't have taken such a risk. After calming down, Marinsura realized that her previous mentality was actually very extreme. Her extreme desire for the treasure had made her lose her mind. Now that she thought about it, she felt a little embarrassed. Sigh. Who knew that I would almost lose my life instead of finding the treasure? Rhodey seriously played the role of a listener. He then asked, So, your inability to use magic is also related to this? I was going to keep this a secret for the rest of my life, but now there's nothing to hide. Marinsura unconsciously patted her chest as she looked up at the ceiling with a dejected expression. I lost my connection with the dragon crystal when I opened the entrance outside, so I can't use any spells now. I can't even revert to my true form. She stroked her long hair and said softly, In other words, I won't be able to live for long after I get out of here. As long as I still have the aura of the dragons on me, they will definitely come after me. This feeling was terrible. It was like waiting for death after being cursed by the doomsday curse. Marinsura looked calm, but in fact she was in despair. Roddy frowned slightly. This kind of matter was up to the heavens, and it had nothing to do with him. However, when he saw the disheartened and beautiful figure, he paused for a moment. In the end, he still decided to speak his mind. My strength is weak, and I might not be able to help you much. However, there is something that you might have forgotten to consider. Blindly running for your life or fighting head-on is actually a bad plan. Marinsura closed her eyes and sighed. What else can I do? Robbers rob for money. The peasants are rebelling for power. If we can't defeat the bandits or the rebel army, I think it's better to throw away our money and power and temporarily get out of danger. You mean you want me to learn from those despicable human nobles? Speaking of which, the arrogant dragons were much more moral than humans. In the eyes of the dragons, the human nobles were actually very laughable. On the one hand, they talked about the 8 cardinal virtues and stood on the moral high ground in everything they did. On the other hand, they shamelessly did despicable things and trampled on the moral standard. Everything the human nobles did was related to their own interest. Even if they were beaten to a pulp by the orcs, they would still shamelessly use gold coins and resources to sue for peace. The phrase, despicable human nobles, was actually true. However, Roddy, who had just become a baron, was also implicated because of this. This world has never been fair, right? Dragons have their own way of living, and ants have their own way of living. Roddy smiled. He didn't think that Merlin Sarah was being sarcastic. After all, it was normal for people who lived in 2 different worlds to have different values. He continued calmly, I don't have dragon scales and I don't know magic. Even if I worked hard for my entire life, I wouldn't be as strong as you were when you were 10 years old. However, if I were to be hunted down by an enemy, I would do anything to survive, because the longer I live, the more hope I have. But this isn't to prolong my life. It's so that one day I can take back what I've lost. Roddy's words were very calm. Merlin Sarah didn't have much of a reaction after listening to him. However, her gaze was obviously a little absent-minded. After losing the connection with the dragon crystal, she was already no different from the ant he had mentioned. If he chose to face the problem in another way, was there really hope for revenge? Seeing that the shadow dragon was deep in thought, Roddy didn't say anything else. As a friend recognized by the dragons, this was all he could do. The most important thing for him now was to figure out what he should do next. The mission of Baranchulu Must Die was not completed because the demigod was only completely sealed by the enhanced magic circle. It was not even close to death. It seems like this mission can't be completed. A legendary level mission was not so easy to complete. Roddy didn't have much hope before, but now he had no regrets. From a player's point of view, this kind of high-level mission that allowed him to jump more than 30 levels was actually of little value. It looked tempting, but there was nothing he could do. He sighed and closed the mission panel. Then, he opened the character status panel again. Only then did he realize that the death of the snow monsters in the 3 instance dungeons actually counted as a portion of EXP. Although each of them only gave him 10 to 100 points, the accumulated EXP was shocking. Even though he had just leveled up, the remaining EXP was still enough for him to level up 1 advanced level and 1 basic level. Without any hesitation, Roddy immediately allocated the EXP to the Witcher Advanced Profession. As the light flashed, notifications of increased attributes and new skills flashed past, but Roddy didn't feel any excitement at all. There was a level 67 dragon sitting beside him, and he was almost killed by a level 85 plus demigod just now. Compared to these guys, the words Advanced Level 11 in front of him was really trash. However, Roddy also knew that all of this was just a product of coincidence. The real thing he had to deal with was the orc language undead, not the illusory orphan of the dragons or the immortal demigod. With a sigh of self-consolation, he opened the skill panel and looked at the new skills. Life Domination Consumption, all stamina instant cast use. The HP of the character and the magic pet can be swapped. Cannot be used when the magic pet dies. Cooldown time 24 hours. Note: the user will suffer severe side effects. This skill was very familiar to Roddy. Then, he remembered that the Warlock branch of the demon magic in the game had a similar skill called Contract, Life Conversion. The effect was to switch the HP of the user and the demon pet. However, the skill needed to be cast continuously for 3 seconds, and all potions and healing skills would be ineffective for 5 minutes after the conversion. Every skill that seemed like a bug came with a heavy price. Most of the skills of the warlock class were stronger than the skills of the other professions, but that was not the case in actual combat. Often, a warlock would have the upper hand from the beginning to the end, but in the end they would be tortured to death by the side effects of the skills. What about this skill? Roddy stared blankly at the words, severe side effects, for a while. Then, he closed the interface. He didn't bring the Nokia or the Kata duck here, so he would try it when he got back. After adding the talent points, Roddy turned around and saw that Merlinsula was deep in thought with her head down and her hands on her chest, so he didn't disturb her. He opened the map bar and wanted to go outside the palace to find Akasha and the others, but he stepped on a stone fragment after taking 2 steps. Just as he was about to leave, Roddy glanced at it casually and suddenly froze. This was the stone platform that used to seal Birchaloo. Previously, Roddy thought that the carvings on it were all magic patterns, but now he realized that they were scattered High Elves words. He tried to spell it out for a long time and finally managed to read out the words that he could recognize. Soul immortal. Physical body. But what? He looked around and found another larger fragment from the pile of bodies of the snow monsters. The elements will tell. Merlinsula's voice suddenly came over. The elements will tell you everything. Roddy raised his eyebrows. This sentence, it's exactly the same as the one carved on the stone tablet outside. Merlinsula rubbed her forehead and actually smiled peacefully. The entire city was built to seal this guy. Although I don't like the High Elves, I have to admit that Solomon's elemental magic is far better than mine. He forcefully sealed a demigod and killed all the snow monsters. His skills are truly amazing. Seeing her calm expression, Roddy knew that his persuasion had no effect. Well, he was just a mortal. He wasn't strong enough to influence the dragons to give up on their principles. Thank you, Roddy. Merlinsula seemed to have made a decision. Her tone suddenly became solemn. I will protect you until you leave the Deathward Ravine. As for the future, let's leave it to fate. May the dragon god bless you, human. When the time came to an end, Roddy sighed and solemnly bowed back. After that, the two of them no longer said anything and walked out of the palace. In order to alleviate the heavy atmosphere, Roddy said casually, Solomon should be an ice magician, right? Anyway, I've never seen so many icicles appear out of thin air. Some dragons can do it, but I really don't know how many can do it just based on magic arrays. Merlinsula was also avoiding certain emotions. At this moment, she felt a rare sense of peace and relaxation in her heart. She also spoke more casually. In the past, I might have stopped to observe the flow of the elements in the air, but now, I can't feel it at all. Oh, can you see the flow of the elements directly? Roddy had recently studied the crystal embedding technique, but it was obvious that it was still far from the elemental theory that mages were familiar with. Naturally, he was curious about the theory of observing the elements. Human mages resonate with the energy of this world through meditation. They use their bodies as a container to store magic power, sense the elements and other forces, and finally control them. Merlinsula was indeed a mage. She clearly summarized the nature of mages in one sentence. Dragons are different. Because of the dragon crystal in their bodies, I was born with the perception of a human magician. I can directly observe the flow of the elements in the air. Roddy was a little ignorant in this area, but he knew that magician was the title for mages above level 30. He sighed inwardly. The existence of dragons was like a bug. Then, he suddenly thought of something. Does my Witcher's vision have a similar effect? Chapter 439. Outside the magic tower, Sodalar was leading 10 soldiers and Akasha towards the White Palace. They had experienced all kinds of battles and escapes in a day. To be honest, even Sodalar, who was the strongest among them, felt his legs go weak. Fortunately, everyone had eaten something when they were guarding the outer wall, or they would definitely be paralyzed now. Slurp, because of the physical damage from the icicles, a lot of the snow monster's internal organs splattered on the ground when it died, so the soldiers' leather boots made unpleasant noises. If it were anyone else, they would have been scared silly by this hellish scene, but Sodeler and the others were already used to it. Even their expressions did not change. "Let's hurry. Roddy's situation is not good." Akasha had witnessed the scene of Rhodey being injured in the array. At that time, she was burning with anxiety. That was why the team that had just entered the Demon Tower did not even have time to rest. She immediately sent a team to rush over. But compared to the panicking priest, Sodeler was clearly more cautious. Even though there were no living creatures around, he still made the soldiers wear what little armor they had left, and each of them carried several secondary weapons. He even carried his dragonbone shield and walked in front, vigilant of any possible enemies. The team quickly left the protection of the magic tower. After passing through the long corridor that separated the two areas, they entered the White Palace area. In front of them were still a large number of corpses and icicle fragments. The surroundings were abnormally quiet, but after a few steps, Sodeler suddenly stopped and raised his hand to make a tactical gesture of "be on guard." "What's wrong?" Akasha stopped in her tracks and looked ahead in confusion. There was nothing strange about the corpses around, and only the sound of the cold wind could be heard. Akasha waited for a long time, only to see Sodeler frowning and sniffing, closing his eyes to sense something. After a while, he removed the "be on guard" command. "Something doesn't feel right. Maybe I'm thinking too much." Sodeler shook his head with a solemn expression, then made a "continue forward" gesture. Cough, cough, cough. Natha, who had just woken up from her coma, opened her eyes. She endured the pain and tried to get up, but the soldier who was looking after her persuaded her to stay back. "Reverend Akasha told you not to move. She has gone with Captain Sodeler to rescue Sir Roddy." In her field of vision were the familiar soldiers. Nada felt a lot more at ease after hearing their word. She nodded without saying a word and lay back down. The rest of the soldiers were resting and reorganizing on the first floor of the magic tower. Several burly barbarians who had luckily escaped were curiously pointing at the corpses in the laboratory on the first floor and discussing something. Two soldiers were standing guard at the gate. The atmosphere was relaxed and calm. All the danger seemed to have dissipated. Natha heaved a sigh of relief. She then realized that there was a circular hole not far from her. Because she had already observed the situation below with Akasha, she was not very interested in the ice crystal vein. She slowly exhaled and closed her eyes to rest. But right at this moment, a slight vibration caused her to open her eyes wide. Natha suddenly turned her head and stared at the underground area where the ice crystal vein was. As a wood elf, she had incomparably sensitive senses that humans could not compare to. But when she felt something wrong, the soldiers and barbarians on guard around her did not seem to notice anything. Buzz, like countless bees flapping their wings in her ears, Natha felt that the buzzing seemed to be getting louder and louder. She instinctively stretched out her hand and pulled the longbow to her side. She was more and more certain that the sound came from the ice crystal vein. "What's going on?" Asterisk, 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 asterisk. In the White Palace, Roddy had the same doubts as Natha. The skill description of Witcher's vision was a little vague. Roddy had never understood the concept of opening a Witcher's unique vision. He had used this skill several times, but apart from blurred vision and dizziness, there was no effect. But at this moment, Witcher's vision seemed to let him see a whole new world. Roddy's vision was filled with colorful threads. They were as light as spider silk floating in the air, swaying to some kind of rhythm. He involuntarily stretched out his hand and found that these thick threads immediately dispersed like repulsive magnets. After careful observation, Roddy gradually distinguished the various colors. But when he shifted his gaze, he suddenly froze and stared closely at the largest relief sculpture in the middle of the wall. Under the demon hunter's vision, the map that originally depicted the magic circle had completely changed. Countless flowing elements, like ribbons of light, filled the empty space on the relief sculpture that was supposed to be empty. Now they were filled with countless lines. Roddy immediately realized that these lines and lines that suddenly appeared were definitely not the product of coincidence. Beside him, Marinthra was a little puzzled by Roddy's surprise. But when Roddy described everything that appeared on the relief sculpture, her expression immediately changed. "You can clearly see these elements?" This was the first question. Back in the Silent Forest, she had confirmed that Roddy was not a mage. It was impossible for a person who was insensitive to elements to suddenly become a magus in half a year. This was definitely not normal. But what puzzled her even more was the second question. "You said that the area of this spell formation is 5 times larger than what was originally shown?" "That's right. If the ratio is correct, its edge even extends beyond the Deathward Ravine." So this is also here?" When Roddy compared his own map column, he found that the ruins that he had led the team to collect the mission reward was actually one of the components of the spell formation. He had originally thought that Khadgar's construction of Elson City could be considered a great work, but at this moment, he realized how short-sighted he was. The area of this huge magic circle was probably 1/3 of the Glacial Plains map. What was Solomon trying to do? How many resources and time did he spend on this? The shock in his mind made Roddy feel a little suffocated. But when he realized that the Witcher's vision would only last for 60 seconds, he immediately looked carefully at the most conspicuous area on the relief sculpture, the center of the dungeon's magic tower. And when he looked carefully, the lines that surrounded the center of the magic tower actually formed a long line of faintly discernible words. Kl dasmujin verdisa, Vasi. Puzzled, Roddy tried to spell out these words formed by the High Elves, wondering why these things did not make sense. Unexpectedly, when Marinthra heard his words, her expression suddenly changed and she shouted, "Stop! Stop!" Roddy immediately shut his mouth and looked around vigilantly. After confirming that there was no abnormality, he also realized that he had been too rash. He apologized in a low voice, "Sorry, I don't know much about spells. What kind of spell is this?" The shadow dragon was speechless for a few seconds, because she was just as shocked as Roddy. This shouldn't be here. This is the eternal night. This is something that only dragons have." She did not finish her sentence because it involved the secrets of the dragons. Every race had some scum or sinners who were hated by both humans and gods, and dragons were no exception. And because of their powerful abilities, an adult demigod giant dragons could not be killed by ordinary means. Therefore, the dragons specially built a forbidden place called the Eternal Night Tomb to execute their own kind. Over there, the dragon clan, who had committed the most heinous crimes, would be annihilated by the power of the formation. No matter how many souls this fellow had split, or how many phylacteries he had, it would be useless. And the reason why Marinthra knew so much about this was because her most powerful uncles were all executed in this way. She had once thought of saving these uncles and studied the structure and activation method of the Eternal Night Tomb. However, because of her limited ability, she could only watch as these powerful uncles died, but this shadow dragon would never have thought that she would see the same magic circle in a ruin. If I'm not wrong, Solomon is doing this to deal with Baranchalu. After hearing her describe the function of the magic circle, Roddy immediately thought of many things. Then should I activate the magic circle now to kill it? Is it a good choice? No. It's not that simple. Although Marinthra did not see the complete magic circle, she could make a judgment based on the clues she had discovered. This is a nested multifunction magic circle. Its biggest limitation is that each magic circle can't overlap. In other words, the magic circle that can kill it is definitely not here. Roddy's expression darkened. What does Solomon mean? Could it be that he had to dig the sealed Berturu out from the grave and drag him to the casting position to start the incantation? No matter how I think about it, it's a trap. Both of them realized that this city and the Solomon behind it were not simple. They stood in front of the relief and began to talk about Solomon. When the dragon records and the High Elves' historical records overlapped, Rhodey finally understood why Solomon had died in this godforsaken place. To put it simply, it was because he proposed that elements were the truth that High Elf mages should pursue in an era when arcane magic was the mainstream. He even used experimental results to prove this point. As a result, he was banished to this snowy place by those powerful arcanists. No matter what, he's a genius, but he was suppressed to this state. It's like Copernicus. Roddy shook his head. If it wasn't for the fact that strength was the most important thing in this world, Solomon would definitely end up like that unlucky astronomer who proposed the heliocentric theory. Who's Copernicus? A mage who got himself killed because he spoke the truth. At that moment, the two of them heard a scream coming from the entrance of the palace. Rhodey turned his head and saw Akasha running towards him. She then fiercely threw herself into his arms. Roddy. Smelling the faint fragrance in his nose, Roddy tightened his arms and comforted the young priestess who was shedding a lot of tears. Marinsara saw the two of them tightly hugging each other. She narrowed her eyes slightly and then looked away as if nothing had happened. Sodeler's team arrived soon after. They were all familiar with Marinsara, but the atmosphere was a little strange when they met again under such circumstances. After all, the dragons were too powerful in the eyes of mortals. David and the other country bumpkins were no different from observing a god. Seeing Roddy calmly introduce everyone to Marinsara, even Sodeler secretly broke out in cold sweat. When did these two become so close? As a woman, Akasha naturally noticed this. However, she still respectfully greeted Marinsara and took a step back to stand behind Roddy. Although she didn't say anything, her hand was still tightly holding onto Roddy's. Marinsara lowered her eyes and turned to walk towards the gate. Roddy, I'll send you out of the city. Chapter 440. Crack. The sound of rocks shattering caused Roddy to stop in his tracks. Roddy was frightened by the voice. Without saying a word, he turned around and looked at the seal. If it was another team, Roddy's neurotic behavior would have been ridiculed. However, right now, everyone had an almost obsessive trust in Roddy. So, they did not ask any questions and immediately drew their swords, ready to fight. Merlin Sarah was curious about what they were doing, but she was more worried about the seal at the side. She thought of a certain possibility and her expression turned grim. She muttered to herself, could it be that the seal can't hold on any longer? Roddy didn't answer her and immediately began to verify it. He once again activated Demon Hunter Vision, which lasted for a minute. The colorful elemental lines once again appeared in his field of vision. However, this time, Roddy noticed that there were many light red threads in the air. When he looked around, he realized that the blood-red threads were floating from the corpses of the snow monsters and were converging towards a single location. He ran a few steps towards the pile of rocks where Baranchalu was sealed. Then, he discovered that there was a dazzling red light shining deep underground. Is this a sacrifice? Roddy immediately realized that this seemed to be some kind of evil ritual because he clearly saw the words Baranchalu and the slowly rising health bar. After he told Merlin Sarah what he saw, the dark shadow dragon couldn't help but clench her fists and grit her teeth. This might be a blood sacrifice. Its power was suppressed after it awakened once, but its consciousness didn't go into hibernation. I should have realized it. As a demigod, there's no way he would let go of so many corpses. Her voice was trembling because if she guessed correctly, Baranchalu would soon be able to resurrect with the help of these snow monsters' corpses. Demigods weren't like the half-baked necromancers on the continent. As long as there was an opportunity, They would try their best to regain their freedom and reconstruct their bodies. The moment they thought of this possibility, Roddy and Merlinsera looked up at the same time. They exchanged glances and looked at the relief on the wall. The reason why the formation similar to the tomb of Evernight had appeared here was obvious. At this moment she could not care about the manners that dragons should have. She said nervously, "Roddy, quickly find the central function of this magic circle. Its outer ring should have 7 spiral radiation lines. The spell can only be opened by activating it at the key position." "I'm looking. I found it." Roddy stared at the carvings and found the center of the magic circle that Merlinsera had described. "It's right in the center of the magic tower. It's a circular hole," but halfway through his words, he was interrupted by a sudden earthquake. The White Palace shook violently amidst the cracking sounds. Akasha's physique was weaker, and she immediately sat on the ground. In the center of the palace, the originally flat floor suddenly bulged up, and countless cracks extended out. At the same time, everyone could hear the plop 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 heartbeat under the ground. "We can't stop the blood sacrifice anymore." Merlinsera's face instantly turned pale. But Roddy, who had already memorized the activation spell, pulled Akasha up and shouted in the midst of the continuous cracking and falling of the stones, "There's no time. I'm going to activate the magic circle now. You go and lure it over." This was actually the only choice. Even if Roddy did not say it, Merlinsera intended to do so anyway. After all, only Roddy could activate the magic circle, and she was the only one who could fight against Baranchalu. But after confirming this simple battle plan, she reached out her hand and pressed the wound on her abdomen that had not healed. She felt a sense of melancholy in her heart. As a high-level species, dragons always had an indescribable premonition about fate. The world around her seemed to be collapsing, and Merlinsera had a feeling that this might be her last battle. The summoning of the dragon god was approaching, and she, who was burdened with hatred, seemed to be reaching the end of her life. But this thought was abruptly interrupted by Roddy. "Report the number of health potions." "The first team has used them all. I still have 2 intermediate healing potions here." "Then bring them over." Akasha cast all of them with divine spells. Sodalar used the shield. The team that had fought side by side countless times had a tacit understanding. Before the series of commands was even finished, the arrangements were already in place. Roddy tossed 2 bottles of health potions over. Merlinsera instinctively reached out to catch them, and immediately felt rays of golden light enveloping her body. The feeling of her wounds healing at an accelerated rate stunned her for a moment. And when Roddy walked over with a pile of equipment, the shadow dragon who wanted to say something felt a lump in her throat. After fighting alone for so many years, she had almost forgotten the feeling of having someone fully supporting her. But dragons also had their own pride. In their eyes, armors and weapons were always the playthings of the weak. They trusted their claws and scales the most, so when Roddy handed over the shield and battle axe in his hands, she stiffened and wanted to refuse. Dragons don't use weapons. But Roddy had no intention of respecting the customs of dragons. He raised his hand and put the shield made from the skull of the frost dragon Wisam on her arm. At the same time, he handed over the battle axe that belonged to the king of axes Sauron. "Do you still want to save face at a time like this? Try your best to hold on for 5 minutes. I'll make all the preparations in the magic tower." Roddy didn't look like he was facing a giant dragon at all. He let go of the handle of the axe and turned around to make a tactical gesture. "Retreat. Those who are familiar with the route lead the way. Akasha, follow me. Sodalar, bring up the rear." "Yes." "Understood." After a series of responses, the team of 13 rushed towards the palace in the second wave of the earthquake and quickly disappeared from Merlinsera's sight. Before Roddy left the gate, he looked back and met the shadow dragon's eyes with the flashing mark of the dragon slayer. He raised his hand and made a good luck gesture. But Merlin Sarah didn't respond. She just stood there calmly with the shield and battle axe in her hand. The dragons are really calm, sighing. Roddy caught up with the team and sped up their retreat towards the magic tower. But he didn't know that the moment he looked away, Merlin Sarah bit her lips lightly and wanted to say something but stopped herself. The shadow dragons had always been known for their arrogance. Even among the dragons who were generally arrogant, they were still the ones who valued status and identity the most. To put it bluntly, they were like the bloodline of the founding nobles of the human world. Even if they were to decline in the future, they still had an unattainable superiority in their bones. Merlin Sarah had been spoiled since she was a child, and was influenced by the culture of her clan. Therefore, she had always looked down on humans, high elves, and other races. They are just insignificant reptiles. In the long river of time, they are insignificant. This was what Merlinsara's father had taught her. From the perspective of the dragons, this wasn't wrong. In the eyes of the dragons who had lived for thousands or even tens of thousands of years, humans were like ephemeral mayflies that were not worth mentioning. Therefore, when interacting with other races, although the shadow dragons didn't lack manners on the surface, they would always look down on them in their hearts. If it wasn't for the drastic change in their circumstances, Merlin Sarah would probably be like this for the rest of her life. But now, looking at the shrinking corpses around her, the gradually cracking ground, and the expanding aura, she sighed faintly and tightened her grip on the battle axe in her hand. Are the other races really insignificant? After witnessing Solomon's amazing work and experiencing the tenacity of Roddy and the others in the face of the raging waves, her insistence on her identity as a dragon's had unknowingly faded. However, her sigh did not last for a few seconds. The tremors on the ground caused her gaze to gradually turn serious. Baranchalu's seal seemed to have an infinite suction force. It was absorbing the energy that was escaping from the surroundings at an accelerated rate. The red threads that could only be seen by Roddy had now turned into visible blood. Thump, thump. As her heartbeat quickened, Merlin Sarah watched helplessly as a spherical blood-red cocoon gradually burrowed out of the ground. It was growing as quickly as a bamboo shoot sprouting in spring, but anyone could tell that the creature inside the blood cocoon was definitely not an easy target. Naturally, Merlin Sarah wouldn't just watch it grow. She took a deep breath and lowered her head to complain about the material of the dragon bone shield. Then, she raised her battle axe and used all her strength to hack at the blood cocoon in front of her. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. You're saying that there are many snow monster corpses in the magic tower that were used for experiments, and there are only traces of one person using it? Yes, and there is a spell formation at the top of the tower that can control and monitor the entire city. It looks like a battlefield sand table. Roddy and Akasha had a brief conversation as they ran. The magic tower was getting closer and closer, but Roddy was also feeling uneasy. He had already memorized the long incantation in his mind countless times, but he wasn't sure if the spell formation was really as effective as Merlin Sarah said. For something like a spell formation, the slightest deviation could lead to a huge difference. How to activate it and what to pay attention to after activating it were all different. In this regard, his player experience was completely useless. After all, no one in the game meditated every day to study the mysteries of magic, because everyone knew that it was fake, but Roddy's perspective was different from others. In this area's dungeon, he had broken through the outer city wall countless times, and he had just walked around the tomb of the king. The only thing he wasn't clear about was the magic tower area, which he hadn't even entered before. Therefore, he learned some information from Akasha as soon as possible and immediately connected these seemingly messy clues together. Solomon's purpose of experimenting on a large number of snow monsters was clearly not to resell their organs. If Roddy didn't know before, then after combining the clues found in Tar Lake and the super-large armor in the outer city wall, He could figure out Solomon's purpose no matter how stupid he was. Solomon wanted to create an army of snow monsters. The armor, supplies, and even the city wall were all custom-made for this army of snow monsters. A complete and logical story appeared in Roddy's mind. Solomon was expelled by the High Elves' Arcane Society, and with hatred in his heart, he started doing biological research here to create an unstoppable army of snow monsters to take revenge. However, his research unintentionally provoked the powerful Baranchalu, and after a fierce battle, Baranchalu was sealed. Chapter 441. Everything that Akasha had described seemed to support his judgment. Rhodey thought of Solomon's frivolous smile in the king's tomb. He also thought of the great and joyous reliefs at the side. Rhodey speculated that the so-called King Solomon was a talented but arrogant person. Even the demigod Baranchalu was easily defeated by the young Solomon. This mage could definitely be classified as a genius among geniuses. He was definitely smart, but how smart was he? Roddy carefully recalled everything he had seen and heard since he entered the dungeon, and suddenly felt cold sweat seeping out of his back. Why was Baranchalu's soul sealed the moment he appeared? Why was the power of the magic circle able to kill nearly 10,000 snow monsters on the spot? Why did these corpses coincidentally become the best raw materials for the blood sacrifice? And Baranchalu, who was resurrected through the blood sacrifice, had to face a magic circle that specialized in executing demigods. Were there really so many coincidences in this world? Recalling the words engraved on the stone tablet outside the dungeon, Roddy could not help but come to a conclusion. The entire dungeon area was probably a trap set by Solomon to kill Baranchalu. If this trap that spanned nearly 1,000 years had already been set up, then they had actually become Solomon's pawns. Even Marinthra the dragons had been used unknowingly. Roddy knew that the mages in the game had prophecy, but he had never heard of anyone who could reach this level. But the truth was right in front of him. He had no choice but to accept it. Roddy carefully overlapped the clues and finally confirmed his judgment. Once he understood Solomon's motive, although he felt a little powerless, he had a lot of confidence in the upcoming battle. Solomon had made so many preparations, it was probably not as difficult to deal with Baranchalu as he had imagined. When the team entered the magic tower, Roddy looked back and saw that the sky in the distance had turned blood red. "Hurry up," but before he could assign tasks to the team behind him, Sodeler said, "Roddy, can we really deal with that guy? Hand-to-hand combat is out of the question. Later, we must warn everyone to avoid direct combat." Roddy pointed to the stairs next to him. "Later, do as I say. As long as it's of some use, it's fine." Sodeler nodded. He wanted to say something but hesitated. After thinking for a while, he could not help but say, "I feel that there is something strange about this. Although I don't understand formations, isn't this too much of a coincidence?" Roddy, on the other hand, was impressed by his keen intuition. He nodded. "I'm afraid that everything we've encountered here is not a coincidence. But if we go with the flow, we should be able to get out of this predicament. It doesn't feel good to be manipulated." Sodeler grumbled, but he still followed Roddy's instructions and started assigning tasks to the soldiers. The soldiers who had been resting began to run. The barbarian Erwin also mixed in with a few of his companions. There was no longer any estrangement between them, and they seemed to listen to Sodeler's commands. Roddy turned to look at the little priest behind him. He quickly whispered, "Akasha, do you still have enough power to control the formation you mentioned?" Barely. Akasha's magic power was almost depleted, but if she forced herself to overdraw, she could still hold on for a while. She knew that the next battle was crucial, so she did not even think of saying no. Roddy did not say much. He just opened his arms and hugged her tightly. Akasha was a little startled, but she immediately understood the meaning of his action. She nervously held his hand. "Didn't you say, go?" Don't waste time. To be honest, Roddy's judgment of Solomon was one thing, but in the face of a demigod boss, he could not be indifferent even if he wanted to. He did not like to show his emotions, so this hug was the only way he could think of to express his emotions. Then, he did not give her time to react, and walked directly to the octagonal hole. The soldiers had already retreated upstairs, and the hall on the first floor was empty. Roddy scanned the surroundings, but his pupils suddenly contracted when he saw Natha, who was covered in cuts and bruises, struggling to move. He clenched his fists and chanted a spell amidst the cracking sounds of his knuckles. Kaldas Mujinverdaisa, Vasidal Bunakabila. Marinsara judged the effect of the spell from the first half of the spell. With her level of magic, this kind of judgment was usually accurate. However, Marinsara had inadvertently overlooked an important fact. Solomon's attainments in magic had already far surpassed hers, who was a dragon's. Thus, the effect of this seemingly similar activation spell was completely beyond Marinsara's imagination. When the last syllable fell, the hole in the center of the magic tower instantly lit up with a dazzling white light. The ice crystal vein at the bottom of the hole was already shaking. At that moment it was like a rapidly accelerating engine. Even Rhodey, who did not understand magic, could clearly feel the elemental fluctuations coming from it. Wait, elemental waves? Roddy, who had just found a way out with the help of Witcher's vision, was extremely sensitive to the word elemental. He hesitated for only half a second before immediately taking a step back and activating the skill that he once thought was useless. As expected, Witcher's vision didn't disappoint him. In the majestic tornado-like elemental whirlpool, lines of words that no one else could see actually appeared. Those were words that were written by the creator of the magic circle, floating in the air. The words were not long, and Roddy completely memorized them with a single glance. His expression did not change, but his heart was in turmoil. In the next second, he opened the mission panel and found that the interface of Baranchalu must die finally showed the next step. With the help of Solomon, elemental projection, annihilate Baranchalu. It was still a simple and straightforward notification, and still, there was no description of the mission reward. Roddy narrowed his eyes slightly, and his gaze paused on the words floating in front of him for a moment. Then, he took a few steps back and stared ahead. The elemental energy rapidly gathered, and gradually took shape at a speed visible to the naked eye. But in the end it did not form the gate of judgment that could execute a demigod like Marinsara had imagined, but instead it gathered into a person. Flames, hurricanes, lightning, ice cones, and other elemental manifestations suddenly disappeared, and a figure floated in the air above the octagonal hole. A translucent body, a translucent robe, and a staff that was lightly held. At the same time, a blood-red ray of light suddenly shone into the room from outside the magic tower, and what followed was a thunderous roar. Obviously, Baranchalu had been completely resurrected after the blood sacrifice ceremony. "I've finally waited for this day," the figure floating above the magic circle murmured softly. His pure high elf accent was exactly the same as the one Roddy had heard in Wagra's illusion. When this slender, handsome high elf magician opened his eyes and slowly walked in front of Roddy, his disdainful aura was no longer concealed. This was the once all-powerful King Solomon? The genius magician with earth-shattering mastery of the elements? Roddy did not beg for help, but only stared at the figure's head. Level 35 Lord of the Elements, Solomon Estar, Elemental Projection. Clearly, this was not Solomon himself or his soul fragment, but an elemental projection, formed by the combination of some memory fragment and powerful elemental energy. Roddy had heard of such an existence in Earth Splitter before, but he had never seen it with his own eyes. But after seeing the figure's level and status, he was very clear about its position in this dungeon. Generally, there were 3 types of NPCs that appeared in dungeons: enemies, neutral, and friends. Needless to say, enemies, neutral NPCs were often similar to merchants. Some provided quests, some sold special items or buffs, and some were simply mercenaries. And friendly NPCs were mainly divided into two types: those who helped in the dungeon, and those who supported from the sidelines. In other words, the first type was a fighter whose level was similar to the dungeon's standard. They could fight monsters and bosses with the players. The other type was a support with a much lower level. They either needed the player's protection, or they could play a decisive role in certain critical moments of the boss battle. Roddy guessed that Solomon should be the latter, and his words quickly proved this point. Human Baranchalu has been resurrected. The only way to kill him is to put him on the gate of execution. Why didn't you surround him? You should know. I can't afford any failure in setting up this trap. Solomon's eyes narrowed slightly. He did not hide the fact that he was the one who set up the trap. His arrogance spread, and it sounded as if everyone in front of him should be his minions. However, Roddy's expression did not change. He just calmly and quickly replied, "Lord Solomon, it was purely a coincidence that my team and I came here, and we don't have the ability to deal with Baranchalu. My dragon's companions can only hold him back for a moment. As for whether or not they can finally execute him, I have no confidence." Dragon's companions? Solomon's expression, which was originally full of arrogance, changed and then became angry. "I don't care who your companions are, but someone who can come this far must have the ability to injure him and drag him here. Adventurer, I'm not interested in joking. If you can't do it, then I'm afraid you will destroy all my arrangements." Roddy did not reply immediately. Instead, he deduced a lot of information from Solomon's words. Logically speaking, Solomon should be an extremely intelligent person, but his performance seemed to be far more shallow than expected. He could not even hide his emotions. On the other hand, killing Baranchalu might not be as easy as Marinsara thought. At least, he had to injure it. What would be considered as injuring? Roddy did not have the time to study it. He knew that what he could do was to cause as much damage as possible to Baranchalu. And to do that, he looked at the level 35 elemental projection in front of him and pretended to be flustered as he stuttered. Then can I ask you to help me defeat it?" Before he could finish, another loud roar came from outside the magic tower. Baranchalu's voice sounded a little angry, but it was more of a carefree one. It was obvious that the battle between it and Marinsara was reaching its climax. Chapter 442. Marinsara felt that she was in a precarious situation. Baranchalu was one of the most powerful foes she had faced in her life, so she didn't dare to let the blood cocoon continue absorbing energy. She swung her axe at it as soon as it emerged from the ground. Although it had lost its magic ability, the strength of a dragon was not reduced in the slightest. Even though the level of the axe was not high, the blood cocoon was still chopped into pieces on the spot under the powerful attack of the axe. Thus, Baranchalu had awakened in advance even though he hadn't fully recovered his strength. The Baranchalu that Roddy had seen before was a huge shadow, which was the appearance of its original body in its soul state. Logically speaking, it should have absolutely powerful soul energy and magical abilities. However, after it had to use blood sacrifice to recover its physical body, its current state was almost the same as Marinsara's. It could only use physical energy and couldn't recover its peak strength in a short period of time. However, it wasn't interested in considering its own strength at this moment. With a furious roar, Baranchalu charged at Marinsara and launched an attack without hesitation. It was currently only 2 meters tall, and its muscles weren't bulky. Even the horn on its head was short and unimposing. However, its first punch made Marinsara's expression change drastically. Bang! The impact of the collision instantly blew away the blood mist in the surroundings. Merlinsera raised her left arm high, intending to completely block the attack with her shield. However, the moment she felt the force of the attack, she knew that she had underestimated her opponent. She immediately leaned to the side to deflect the force and swung her axe at the same time, cutting into its opponent's shoulder with a loud crack. Baranchalu hadn't felt pain for many years. When the blood splattered, it first felt incredulous. After being stunned for half a second, the pain and humiliation in its heart made its eyes look like they were about to spit fire. It instantly swung both its arms at Merlinsera. This pure physical confrontation wasn't fancy at all. It didn't have the aesthetic aspect of a duel between a noble knight and a knight. It could even be said that the battle between the two didn't even involve punches and kicks. It was basically a one-sided attack and a one-sided defense. Merlina's frail body was as fragile as a bean sprout in front of Baranchalu. The sounds were as dense as the beating of a drum, mixed with Baranchalu's flustered and exasperated roars. The shadow dragon's face was pale as she held on. Blood flowed from the corner of her mouth due to her internal injuries. Her heart was filled with joy. If she had not accepted the shield and weapon Roddy had given her just now, she would have been smashed into minced meat by him. However, her equipment could not make up for the difference in strength between her and Baranchalu. After holding on for about 20 seconds, she realized that Baranchalu's strength seemed to be increasing. His intimidating aura was like a mountain pressing down on her, suffocating her. The blood mist in the surroundings did not disperse. Instead, it continued to gather towards Baranchalu. Merlinsera immediately understood that the blood sacrifice was still going on. She immediately retreated and ran out of the palace. Roddy only wanted her to stall for 5 minutes, and he didn't want her to stay here. Therefore, Merlinsera was determined to deal with him. She leaped out of the palace and weaved through the corpses of the snow monsters with her agility. At this moment, the snow monsters had already turned into mummies. It was obvious that the energy in their flesh was being continuously absorbed by Baranchalu. Perhaps after a while, they would become bloodless scraps, while Baranchalu would regain his peak strength. 3 minutes left. Merlinsera kept repeating the countdown in her mind. She was extremely fast, like a falcon flying across the sky. Behind her, Baranchalu was like a tank. As he charged, everything in his way was smashed into smithereens. Be it the snow monsters' corpses, the low walls, or the stone pillars on the side of the palace, they were all reduced to ashes by his frenzied charge. As he spread his arms and let out a loud roar, a powerful aura suddenly spread out, blowing away the white clouds above his head. Merlinsera's vision darkened, and she almost fell to the ground. Her heart was filled with shock. The strength of this demigod was far more terrifying than she had imagined. Fortunately, Baranchalu had lost his magic ability. Otherwise, Merlinsera would have been smashed to death. Due to the limited conditions, Merlinsera could only lead Baranchalu around the palace for a full 2 minutes before heading towards the magic tower. She didn't do this because time was almost up, but because Baranchalu had already demolished half of the palace with his bare hands. He had no interest in going around in circles. As time passed, Baranchalu's strength was completely different from when he had just charged out of the blood cocoon. He strode forward madly and was actually slightly faster than Merlinsera. After the shadow dragon stepped into the magic tower area, Baranchalu lost his patience. With a roar, he sped up again and dashed behind Merlinsera like a shadow. Damn it! Boom! Merlinsera, who sensed the danger, only had time to turn around and raise her shield. In the next second she was sent flying like a cannonball. The dragon-bone shield, that was indestructible in the eyes of ordinary people, shattered into pieces. With this level of strength, a single punch could probably blast open the gates of Cullen Imperial City. Merlinsera, who was hit by this punch, flew a distance of 30 to 40 meters and fell directly in front of the magic tower's gate. Even though dragons had extremely tough bodies, Merlinsera's entire body was paralyzed. She knew that she didn't suffer much damage, but the violent concussion made it impossible for her to stand up. She couldn't even raise her head. Marinsura was severely injured when she left the glacial plains. Even though she had rested for a few days, the effects of the injuries never faded. After suffering such a heavy blow, she tried her best to open her eyes, but all she could see was the magic tower's gate in front of her. She heard Barantula's angry roar as he leaped up again. It was obvious that he didn't intend to give her any chance. Marinsura sighed softly and closed her eyes in exhaustion. I've done everything I can. Perhaps it's a blessing that I didn't die in the hands of my own kind. Boom! The power of Barantula's punch was no different from an anti-tank missile. It directly smashed a hole with a diameter of more than 3 meters in the flagstone floor. However, after the debris fell to the ground, the majestic Barantula let out a low roar and glared at the magic tower with his blood-red eyes. In her vision, Marinsura was carried by a figure and disappeared into the pure white smoke of the tower in the blink of an eye. Lord Solomon, it's all up to you now. Adventurer, I don't need you to say anything. I know what I'm facing. Marinsura tried her best to open her eyes, but she couldn't see anything around her. However, the conversation that rang in her ears shocked her. Solomon? What's going on? Combining the two conversations, she immediately understood that Roddy had saved her. The shadow dragon slowly regained her senses. Only then did she realize that she was being carried and sprinted. The white smoke filled her vision, and Barantula's roar was deafening in the magic tower. Marinsura helplessly realized that she seemed to owe Roddy another life. Roddy, shoo! Don't make a sound. Roddy's voice was right beside her ear, making Marinsura feel indescribably uneasy. However, she knew that Roddy and the others couldn't fight Barantula head-on. She wanted to say that she still had some strength left, but before she could say anything, Roddy continued, I have something to tell you in advance. Barantula, you lowly worm, die. I've been planning for this day for 800 years. Repent slowly in the abyss, scum. In the thick fog, Solomon was yelling like a mentally retarded person. His words were filled with resentment, and Marinsula couldn't help but break out in cold sweat. Is this guy the invincible Solomon that was recorded in the ancient records? However, Roddy didn't seem to care about Solomon's behavior. After a few words of advice, he brought Marinsura to the 3rd floor of the magic tower, opened a stone door, and dashed into the laboratory. After being gently put down by Roddy, Marinsura leaned against the wall and panted slowly. Although she was severely paralyzed from being sent flying, the shattered dragon bone shield had absorbed most of the energy, so her body wasn't seriously injured. Apart from the fracture in her left arm, her other organs were fine. After taking a few deep breaths, Marinsura's pale face recovered a lot. After the stone door was half closed, the duo could only hear Barantula's roars as he barged around blindly and Solomon's various insults. What you said just now, is it true? That's why I had to drag you here. In the semi-enclosed space, Roddy whispered a few words to Marinsura, and in less than 20 seconds, he rushed out with his short bow. When his figure disappeared into the thick fog outside the door, Marinsura was still in a daze. Obviously, what Roddy said to her just now was too shocking. However, as the sound of fighting came from outside again, she clenched Roddy's sword, the purification blade, and stood up with clenched teeth. At this moment, Roddy didn't even look back. His figure slowly moved forward in the thick fog, and his aura was restrained to the extreme. He was quickly thinking about a strange question in his mind. Why was Barantula so stupid? Its level and strength could completely crush everyone in this dungeon, but the reality was that it didn't behave like an intelligent creature at all. It was completely like the most reckless beast in the jungle, completely following its instincts. Other than attack, attack, and attack, it didn't know how to do anything else. To put it bluntly, it was like a machine that only knew how to kill, and had no ability to think at all. Rhodey clearly remembered Baranchalu's piercingly cold eyes when he was in his soul state. It was completely different from the current Baranchalu who was being played around by Solomon. Why was that? Stupid ape, you only deserve to die in a place like this. Although Solomon was level 35, his anti-gravity, Arctic deep ice, and cloud spell didn't show any magic resistance. Instead, they were extremely effective. With his superb control of the elements, he firmly restrained Baranchalu on the first floor of the magic tower. Roddy narrowed his eyes, and seemed to have an answer in his mind. Crack! Chapter 443. The battle between Solomon and Baranchalu could be summed up in one sentence: a fight between a madman and a fool. Baranchalu had all his strength, but he did not have much brains. Faced with Solomon's endless elemental spells, he could not defend himself at all. The only thing he could do was scream and bang on the floor. Hurry up, adventurer! Baranchalu must suffer enough damage before I can activate the formation. Solomon, whose body was translucent, waved his staff and shouted. He looked like a gangster fighting on the street. Roddy was speechless at this, but he did not have time to complain. He waved his hand and gave the order. A figure had already neared Baranchalu. Don't let it turn around. Roddy shouted at Solomon, who was not far away. The latter actually obeyed and waved his hand to cast several anti-gravity spells on Baranchalu. The snow monster, whose body had already expanded to 2 meters, staggered and instantly lost its balance. At this moment, a shadow quickly appeared from behind and slashed at Baranchalu's back with a longsword. Bang! The imagined scene of flesh and blood splattering did not appear. When the longsword made contact with the flesh, there was a muffled sound. It sounded like a wooden stick hitting a wall, and the huge recoil even caused the attacker to take a few steps back. A demigod's defense was just that unreasonable. Sodaler's face was full of shock. He had used all his strength but had only managed to cut off a few strands of the enemy's hair. It was ridiculous to say such a thing, but it was really happening right in front of his eyes. After Baranchalu was hit, he roared angrily. His eyes were red and he wanted to turn around, but Solomon casually used the strong light spell to make him close his eyes. Crack! The second strike landed on Baranchalu's face, but it also only left a white mark. Not even the most basic skin lacerations appeared. The snow monster was extremely angry after being attacked consecutively. It waved its hand and attacked in front of it. Its movements were really too fast. Sodaler only had time to lean back before he was sent flying by the other party's punch. With a poof, he turned into fog. 30 meters away, Sodaler, who was controlling the shadow doppelganger, instantly turned pale, but then he swallowed hard and continued to control the next doppelganger to attract attention. Baranchalu's power and aura were too terrifying, but aside from the astonishing power, Sodaler felt something inexplicably. He gritted his teeth and tried his best to let the second clone complete the task. However, after holding on for 4 seconds, the clone was defeated once again. On the other side, Solomon kept casting the smoke spell, while he was restraining Baranchalu. Everything in the magic tower gradually became blurry, but most of the mist was gathered above Baranchalu's head. The enraged demigod didn't notice this at all. He only cared about chasing after Sodaler's last clone and quickly smashed it like a fly. After all the enemies disappeared, Baranchalu was momentarily stunned. However, before it could find its next target, blue chains suddenly appeared in the air and immediately bound it to the spot. This was not Solomon's spell, but Akasha's last magic circle support at the top of the tower at the cost of overdrafting her magic power. Advanced Ice Prison. Haha, now's the time. Solomon saw that Baranchalu was trapped and instantly shouted out proudly. However, his gaze did not even look at Baranchalu. Instead, He stared closely at the hastily drawn circle under Baranchalu's feet. That wasn't a magic circle, but a simple mark. Spell dispel. Solomon waved his translucent magic staff into the sky. His gaze was filled with unprecedented ruthlessness. When the incantation was finished, the thick mist above the magic tower seemed to be pushed aside by something. A blurry shadow passed through a 30-meter free fall and directly smashed into Baranchalu's head at the lowest level. Boom! Everyone in the magic tower felt as if their heads had been hit hard. Even Roddy, who was prepared and had covered his ears, felt his vision turn black. However, his gaze was fixed on the position where Baranchalu had just stood, trying hard to identify the other party's state. He said identify because the attack was too ruthless. Roddy knew that it was impossible for him to fight against a demigod, so he directly used a shortcut, mentioned in the dungeon walkthrough. Drop the dismantled stone door from the top and rely on its weight to kill the enemies at the bottom. This method sounded extremely simple, but it was the method that the players used to defeat the final boss of the Magic Tower, Flame Demon Flathell. However, the players did not have Solomon's help back then, so they could only dismantle the stone door and manually smash it down piece by piece. Roddy knew that time was running out, so he quickly asked Solomon to quickly use the knocking spell to dismantle 15 thick stone door pieces. The soldiers carried them and combined them with the help of the bonding spell, and then used the solidifying spell to strengthen the hardness. Finally, he used the high-level levitation spell to suspend it near the top of the tower. After confirming the position, Baranchalu was fixed, the spell was dispelled, and the attack was a success. If the enemy was the Flame Demon Flathell from before, Roddy believed that this attack would be enough to turn the opponent into ashes. "You damned pig! A rat in a hole! Scum that should go to hell!" In the reverberation, only Solomon's excited curses could be heard. The soldiers who had just moved the stone door on the top of the magic tower all poked their heads out to look down, but Sodeler was panting against the wall, his face pale from overexertion of his battle aura. At the top of the magic tower, Akasha pressed her temples as she knelt beside the core of the spell formation. She was in so much pain that she could not speak. Natha, who was already heavily injured, had been silent. At this moment, she stared at Solomon, who was laughing maniacally, and frowned. In the 5 seconds after the loud bang, Baranchalu did not move at all. Just when the soldiers thought that the battle was over, the stone tower, that was made up of more than 10 pieces of door, suddenly split open. In the smoke and dust, Baranchalu stood up shakily. "Damn it! Just a little bit more, I need to injure it severely before I can activate the spell formation." Solomon shouted in shock, and for a moment, he was actually a little flustered. But Roddy did not care about it at all. He appeared like a ghost 20 meters in front of Baranchalu, staring at the words, 65% HP above Baranchalu's head. The short bow in his hand made a bang sound as he shot out the first of the remaining 3 arrows. The arrow had been buffed by Solomon's Armor Break, Magic Break, and Elemental Annihilation, and its damage had increased by several folds. But in that instant Baranchalu almost instinctively tilted his head, causing the arrowhead to hit his cheekbone with a "caw" sound, leaving only a line of blood. Roar! Baranchalu opened his mouth and roared, but who knew that Roddy would not move at all? Roddy's arm instantly swung continuously. Due to a slight deviation, the second arrow shot into Baranchalu's right eye socket and bounced off with a "paw" sound. The third arrow did not miss and directly pierced into Baranchalu's mouth. Although the arrow's attack power was not strong, it was enough to cause a fatal injury if it hit a vital point. But this arrow that could instantly kill most enemies below level 50 was pulled out from Baranchalu's throat, and Baranchalu's HP only dropped from 65% to 64%. Solomon's expression instantly turned sluggish, and the hearts of the soldiers above also hung in their throats. They could no longer think of anyone else who could hurt this terrifying demigod. Barantula locked onto Roddy as he snapped the arrow. His body leaned forward, his face contorted in anger, waiting to tear Roddy into pieces in the next second. But at that moment, a silver light silently appeared from the side. Marinsura's figure suddenly leaped out from the thick fog above, and the purification blade in her hand ruthlessly stabbed into the side of Barantula's neck. The 3 arrows were only a smokescreen, and Roddy risked his life to attract his opponent's attention. Only Marinsura's all-out attack was his real trump card. In Roddy's vision, Barantula's HP dropped from 64% to 49%, and then dropped to 48% in 2 seconds. There was no need for a reminder. Solomon's face lit up with joy, and he immediately started chanting an incantation. The elemental fluctuations in the air suddenly became intense, and basin-sized runes lit up on the octagonal pit. A glowing sphere with a strange pattern appeared, as if it was tearing through space. Roddy retreated without saying a word. However, Marinsura did not retreat. She continued to stab at Barantula with her sword. However, Barantula grabbed her and slammed her to the ground. At the same time, Barantula gave her a kick. Bang! This kick was so powerful that the shadow dragon crashed into the wall over 10 meters in the air, and then there was no more sound. Barantula was unforgiving, and just as he was about to charge forward, a huge suction force suddenly pulled him back. Die! Solomon's voice came from afar. As he suddenly waved his staff, the spherical gate of execution actually extended out white ribbons in response. After entangling Barantula, it began to retract. No matter how this guy struggled, he could not stop himself from approaching the ball of light. It was as if its invincible body was torn apart the moment it came into contact with the ball of light. It cried out in pain, but that cry soon came to an abrupt end, because its body had disappeared from this world forever. You killed Barantula, obtained 127,4500 EXP. You completed the mission. Barantula must die. You obtained 546,000 EXP. You obtained 5 additional talent points. You obtained the reward mission, Glory of the Elements. You obtained. Rows of words flashed across the screen, but Roddy had no time to read them. He rushed out of the cover and ran towards the motionless figure in the corner of the magic tower. Marinsura! Behind him, Solomon, who had gotten his wish of killing Barantula, lowered his staff. He shifted his gaze away from the gradually disappearing gate of execution and slowly narrowed his eyes. Chapter 444. The spherical gate of execution began to shrink. As Barantula's body disappeared, the entire magic tower was engulfed in a storm due to the violent elemental fluctuations. This storm was invisible to the naked eye. To Sodeler and the others, everything had returned to normal as if the battle was over. But only Roddy, who had activated his Demon Hunter vision again, knew that if this spell formation that contained astonishing power went out of control, it would be powerful enough to raze the entire dungeon to the ground. But even though he knew this, Roddy pretended as if he didn't see it. He sprinted to the corner of the collapsed wall, ignoring Solomon who was staring at him. He used his hands to dig through the rubble and shouted, "Sodeler, bring some people over to help." Amidst the clamor of footsteps, the pile of rubble where Merlinsera was quickly surrounded by the soldiers. On the other side, Solomon, whose body was semi-transparent, slowly shifted his gaze away. His previously excited expression was now indescribably strange. He raised his magic staff and pointed at the gate of execution, carefully controlling something. When the violent elements gradually calmed down, the gate of execution finally disappeared completely. But the moment the sphere disappeared, something suddenly fell from the center of the spell formation to the ground. "It's this," Solomon's gaze sharpened, and he quickly waved his magic staff. The magician's hand skillfully grabbed the dark red crystal, and then silently brought it over. This crystal was the size of a fist. Solomon reached out to hold it with a fiery gaze. His palm was almost transparent, and it would probably disappear completely in a few minutes. But at this moment, he didn't care, and directly chanted a series of incantations. In an instant, the light emitted by the red crystal completely enveloped him. In less than a minute, Solomon's almost transparent body became abnormally solid, and looked no different from a real person. After the transformation, Solomon's Chunibu aura seemed to have disappeared instantly. He slowly inhaled, and when he opened his eyes again, the aura of a superior and disdainful person instantly spread out. At this time, Roddy finally pulled the shadow dragon out of the rubble with the help of the soldiers. She was severely injured and her breathing was abnormally weak. It was only because she was holding on that she did not faint. When Roddy shouted her name, she could only open her mouth slightly, unable to make any response. When Solomon saw this scene, his eyes flickered slightly. He put down the red crystal in his hand and said, "Adventurers." Roddy and the others immediately raised their heads. "You have helped me fulfill my lifelong wish. In return, I, the Elemental Lord Solomon, am willing to grant you sufficient rewards." There seemed to be no problem with what he said, but Roddy could hear that he was completely condescending. In his eyes, they seemed to be small minions waiting for a gift, and Solomon was a superior who held the power of life and death. "Your Excellency Solomon, if possible, I hope to save my companion first." Roddy did not show any eagerness. He only lowered his head to examine Merlinsera's injuries, and then gently bandaged her wounds. Hearing this, Solomon narrowed his eyes slightly, and his gaze rested on Merlinsera for a moment. The corners of his mouth twitched slightly, and he continued to say, "Your companion is very brave. If you want her to recover, I may have a way." "Really?" Roddy immediately raised his head, and without a doubt, he said, "I have used up all my potions, and my adjutant has no magic power to cast any divine spells. I only hope that Your Excellency Solomon can save her life. She is the last member of the Shadow Dragons." Not only Solomon, but even Sodalar was a little stunned when he heard this. However, he quickly recovered and continued to help Roddy bandage her wounds as if nothing had happened. Holding the staff in his hand, Solomon did not speak for a few seconds. His slightly flickering eyes seemed to reveal some complicated emotions. But soon, he nodded and went to Merlinsera's side. He waved his staff lightly, and her body slowly floated up. "My magic power has not fully recovered, so I can only use the power of the magic circle to heal her." The red crystal that he was holding just now had already been hidden somewhere. Solomon raised his arm and pointed at the ground next to his feet in a seemingly casual manner. Lines of magic patterns quietly appeared as he chanted an incantation, and in less than 10 seconds, a large magic circle was temporarily constructed. This was the embodiment of the ability of the Master of the Magic Tower. Solomon slowly placed Merlinsera in the center of the magic circle, and did not forget to say, "Adventurers, your efforts have been recognized by me, so I will do my best to heal her injuries. If she grasps this opportunity well, her ability to control the elements in the future will also increase by a level. Thank you, Your Excellency Solomon." Solomon's words were very meaningful. Roddy narrowed his eyes after hearing this, but still bowed to express his gratitude. He did not forget to ask the surrounding soldiers to take a few steps back. But just as everyone dispersed in all directions, Merlinsera, who was lying in the center of the magic circle, tilted her head slightly and exchanged a glance with Roddy. Turning his face, Roddy suddenly realized that Sodalar was frowning and gesturing to him. "Do you need to prepare for battle?" Obviously, Sodalar did not trust Solomon at all. At this moment, he was extremely cautious and prepared to take precautions. Roddy was really impressed by this future sword sage's keen sense of smell. Actually, there was no need for his reminder. As the person who opened the magic circle and saw the real Solomon's message, Roddy's heart was already as clear as a mirror. When this elemental projection was created, there was a contract restriction. Even if Baranchelu died, it would also dissipate on its own. And the current situation just happened to prove the worries of that elemental king. This elemental projection was probably already free from the contract and had become an independent existence. With this in mind, Roddy raised his hand and responded, "Fall back and stand by." After giving the order, Roddy heard a buzz sound. A hemispherical barrier suddenly appeared in front of him, covering Solomon and Merlin-Sarah, isolating everyone else outside. "They really can't wait," Roddy sighed inwardly, but he asked in surprise, "Sir Solomon, this is, as expected." His words did not receive any response. Sodeler immediately realized something. He drew his sword and slashed vertically, but the blade was directly repelled by the barrier and did not even leave a mark. If this was all a misunderstanding, Solomon would definitely turn around and give an explanation. However, he only sneered and looked at Merlin-Sarah without blinking. With a wave of his hand, a red mist condensed in the surroundings. This scene was not unfamiliar to Roddy at all, because it was exactly the same as when Baranchelu performed the blood sacrifice. "I originally thought I would have to wait for a long time, but now shadow dragons that have lost the ability to resist can help me complete the body reconstruction. Insignificant human, I really have to thank you." Solomon, who slowly turned around, had a mocking expression. His confident expression with the crystal in his hand was surprisingly similar to the Baranchelu that Roddy had seen in the palace. In an instant, Roddy finally completely connected all the clues in his mind. Solomon had died a long time ago, but the elemental projection he left behind had been eroded and influenced by Baranchelu's consciousness for hundreds of years. As a result, after it was awakened, its words and actions were strange and exaggerated. It even refused to disappear after completing its mission, and desperately sought a way to continue living. And the reason why the body of Baranchelu that had just been killed had no intelligence was because it had condensed all of its soul consciousness into that red crystal. When the elemental projection tried to use the red crystal to restore its body, it did not know that it had already been taken over by Baranchelu. Although it was currently only in a weak soul state, although it still needed a series of sacrifices to restore a complete body, it had indeed escaped the power of the gate of execution, and was still alive in this world. In other words, Baranchelu had actually seen through Solomon's plan and made all of his efforts go up in smoke. A demigod really is a demigod, not a single one of them is stupid. Facing the demigod that mocked him in the High Elves' language, Roddy had to admit that the situation before him was bigger than he had imagined. But as surprised as he was, he did not show any signs of panic. Instead, he calmly looked at Baranchelu, who was holding the soul crystal in his hand. The demigod who had thought that victory was already in his grasp was surprised, but he knew that this level 45 elemental barrier was not something that Roddy and the others could break through. He shook his head and sighed. "The outcome has already been decided. No matter how natural you act, it's useless." "Is that so?" Roddy suddenly smiled. The gleaming white teeth made Baranchelu suddenly feel that it, who had always been meticulous, seemed to have missed out on something. But what happened next made him not know whether to laugh or cry. The human in front of him suddenly turned pale, his skin shriveled as if his blood had been sucked out, and then he fell stiffly to the ground. Baranchelu did not expect Roddy, who had been boasting just a second ago, to commit suicide the next second. He laughed out loud. But before it could mock him, it suddenly felt its field of vision suddenly spinning. Bang! His elemental body was suddenly smashed into the barrier by a huge force. A large spider web-like crack immediately appeared. "This is impossible." Before he could finish speaking, the wind from the punch came again. The speed was so fast that he did not have time to cast a spell, and his chest was punched through. Bang! The fist went through his body and shattered the barrier without any resistance. Baranchelu could not imagine how he would be attacked. When the beautiful face filled with hostility appeared in his vision, his eyes widened abruptly, and he said in shock, You aren't. Merlin Sarah did not give him a chance to speak. Her HP was restored to 100%, and all her wounds were healed. She attacked with all her might, and without any hesitation, she turned Baranchelu into elemental dust. She was actually at level 67, so attacking an elemental clone that was not even level 40 didn't require any extra skills. After the opponent's weak body dissipated, Merlin Sarah picked up the red crystal that represented Baranchelu's last line of defense. But before she moved, she suddenly looked up at Roddy. I don't want to be targeted by a demigod. Although Roddy was sitting with a terrible expression, he showed an ugly smile and waved his hand weakly. As a dragon's, Merlin Sarah did not take his words as a joke. Instead, she took it as an order. She raised her hand and shattered the crystal with a loud wail. Chapter 445. Crack, the red crystal shattered into pieces, and the vessel that contained Baranchelu's soul consciousness shattered, which meant that this demigod was finally dead. The fragments on the ground gradually lost their original luster, and the originally sturdy crystal completely turned into inconspicuous stones. Merlin Sarah threw it aside and took a deep breath. She turned to look at Roddy, who was no different from a mummy. When they were rescued by Roddy to the laboratory above the magic tower, they already knew what was going to happen. At that time, they were faced with a choice. Should they let Solomon's projection pretend to be unaware of Baranchelu's manipulation and continue acting, or should they find a chance to take a risk and kill Baranchelu directly to solve the problem once and for all? Although each choice could cost them their lives, it wasn't a problem for the two of them who had experienced countless battles and battles. At that moment, Roddy proposed a plan, but the premise of the plan was to make Merlin Sarah his magic pet in the next few minutes. Perhaps it was because she gradually built up trust in Roddy, or perhaps it was because she didn't have much time to think, but Merlin Sarah only took half a second to agree to sign a soul contract with Roddy and carried out his plan without reservation. In the end, this shadow dragon successfully deceived everyone, and with the help of Roddy's life domination, they narrowly killed Baranchelu. This should have been a perfect ending. But the reality was far from it. Now that the enemies were gone, Merlin Sarah started to feel uneasy. The crisis of life and death was over, but the crisis of trust was right in front of her. Humans were greedy, shameless, and treacherous, and this was a fact that was widely acknowledged by the dragon race. How could she have agreed to Roddy's plan and become his magical pet? The word trust was very heavy. You could lend money to a good friend, you could help them, and you could give them a lot, but how many people were willing to give their entire lives to a good friend? Moreover, the trust between Merlin Sarah and Roddy was only built on the threat of a common enemy. Before this, they didn't have any solid foundation of friendship. A soul contract was not something to be trifled with. The proud dragons had never signed such a contract with a lower species before. His actions had already crossed the bottom line of the dragons. What if he breaks the contract? The scene of her becoming a slave and slaughtering people under Roddy's orders immediately surfaced in Merlinsara's mind. Then, to her despair, she realized that it was more likely that she would become another type of slave to a human being. Thinking about how she would be forced to do those disgusting things, Merlinsara's expression changed several times. She clenched her fists so hard that they made cracking sounds, and she was filled with regret. Would he keep his promise? As a dragon's, she knew that the price of the life exchange contract was great. Looking at Roddy's mummified appearance, she knew that as a human, how could he bear the pain that she had to bear as a dragon's? But does this mean trust? Not to mention the humans, when Merlin Sarah recalled the betrayal of her own kind, her heart that had just calmed down immediately started to churn. Perhaps in this world, there was no one worthy of her trust except herself. There were many treacherous humans, and she definitely couldn't rely on luck when it came to the one in front of her. Thinking of this, Merlin Sarah clenched her fists, gritted her teeth, and walked straight towards him. Roddy, who had a splitting headache, really couldn't take it anymore. Fortunately, he had received enough EXP after completing the mission. After leveling up once and recovering his HP to full, he finally had the strength to check his status bar: weakened. All attributes reduced by 30%, remaining 3 days, weakened. All resistances reduced by 50 points, remaining 5 days, weakened. Unable to use any skills, remaining 1 day, stunned. Accuracy reduced by 50%, remaining 1 day. Although his HP had recovered to 100%, Roddy still felt dizzy and his ears were ringing. But even so, he knew what he had to do. Magic Pet pane opened. Do you want to cancel the soul contract? Looking at this line of notification, Roddy couldn't help but smile bitterly. Having dragons as a magic pet was indeed shocking, but if he didn't cancel the contract, wouldn't it mean that he could dominate the entire continent? How many people had died because of greed? Roddy shook his head and chose to confirm without hesitation. The connection between him and Merlin Sarah in his mind was suddenly cut off. When the similar resonance disappeared, Roddy let out a sigh and fell into a deep sleep because his body couldn't bear the exhaustion. He didn't even realize that he had brushed past death in a split second. Behind him, Merlin Sarah, who had already pointed her fingers like a knife, suddenly stopped in her tracks with a complicated look in her eyes. When he woke up again, Roddy felt more exhausted than if he had run a marathon. When he opened his eyes, a lock of chestnut-colored hair in front of his nose made him want to sneeze. But when Roddy inhaled, he also smelled a familiar fragrance. He reached out and gently stroked Akasha's hair, the instinctive wariness in his eyes replaced by gentleness. The little priest wasn't lying next to Roddy, but had fallen asleep on a wooden chair at the side. Obviously, when Roddy was unconscious, she hadn't left his side at all. When she heard movement, she hurriedly rubbed her eyes and wanted to get up to get a glass of water, but before she could stand up, Roddy pulled on the corner of her clothes. How long have I been asleep? A little more than a day. It's almost night now. Are you hungry? I'll go get you something to eat. Akasha's face was still a little pale, obviously the aftereffects of overexertion of magic power. Roddy held her slightly cold hand with a little heartache. He sat up from the bed and pulled the little priest to sit beside him. Roddy rarely showed such initiative. Akasha's eyes reddened, and she turned and threw herself into his arms. Next time. Don't do this next time. Okay. Although she didn't say it explicitly, Roddy knew that this dungeon experience had almost brought everyone to the brink of death. Logically speaking, he had levels and equipment, and the team he brought was also a strong professional team. How did he end up fighting a demigod? Akasha, who was in his arms, had lost a lot of weight. When Roddy glanced at her status bar, his heart ached even more. The debuff weak. Magic power recovery speed reduced by 90%, remaining 2 days, meant that she had really fought with her life on the line. He was afraid that if she had overexerted any more magic power, her body would have suffered permanent damage. Roddy didn't say a word and quietly hugged her. The two of them enjoyed a rare moment of peace. Finally, it was Akasha who was worried that Roddy would be hungry. Her face was rosy as she went to get hot food and hot water. As she watched Roddy eat, she told him what had happened over the day. This is the dormitory area of the inner city walls. Sodeler brought some men to guard the outer city walls. At the same time, they cleaned up the bodies of the snow monsters. Natha's body is much better, but no matter how much I persuaded her, she still took her bow and went to guard the inner city walls. These few days, when she was resting, she was still practicing her archery, Roddy nodded. Powerful enemies were often the greatest motivation to advance. It wasn't strange for Natha to do this. He drank a few mouthfuls of hot soup and was surprised to find that there was a lot of venison in it. Seeing this, Akasha explained, that was brought back by Erwin and his men. He seems to be very obedient to Sodalar now. However, many of the barbarian soldiers died in battle. These barbarians had died because they were afraid to fight and had fled first. Roddy could only sigh about this. The meat was quickly finished. Roddy got up and prepared to go out for a walk. Then, he realized that his tattered, giant beast controller set had basically been scrapped. Now, only his leather boots and wrist guards were still usable. He opened the inventory and checked. The rings and other accessories were still normal. The loss wasn't too big. I should get new equipment when I go back. This was what Roddy thought. His eyes glanced at the magic pet pane. His expression changed and he asked, "Where's Marinsara?" Akasha's expression changed slightly. She whispered, We don't know what she's going to do. We just know that she's in the magic tower." Roddy could understand their fear. When he thought of Marinsara, who had lost the power of the dragon crystal, he suddenly thought of something. After opening the mission pane, he looked carefully and narrowed his eyes. "I don't know if it will work." There was a sudden idea in his mind, but he wasn't sure if it was reliable. Roddy thought carefully for a moment, and then walked out of the stone room with Akasha. The cold wind outside made him shiver. Without the protection of the boundary, the originally warm and humid dungeon was no different from the climate of the glacial plains. As he walked along the road to the outer city wall with Akasha, Roddy gradually had an idea of the harvest of this battle. Killing a demigod brought him countless experience points. At the same time, it also allowed his soldiers to level up, not by 1 level, but at least by 6 levels. In other words, the young people who could only be scouts in Norland Village were now on average at level 23. With this kind of strength and suitable equipment, they were already at the forefront of the current individual strength of the Kingdom of Karen. Before the dark clouds of war enveloped the whole country, these soldiers were already far ahead of the starting line. And Erwin and the barbarian soldiers were even more lucky. Their basic level directly reached an average of level 16. Because of their race, they automatically advanced to Berserker. Among them, the strongest Erwin was a Berserker level 3, and the others were only level 1. Their strength was more than 4 or 5 times more than before. Akasha's Holy Priest was raised to level 13. The basic level was 21, and the total level was 33. Which was higher than Roddy's current level. Chapter 446. Roddy continued to stroll along the city wall. After greeting the patrolling soldiers, he quickly saw Natha, whose base level had risen to level 21. She was looking at the city wall. When Roddy greeted her, she was as taciturn as ever. However, her lowered gaze seemed to be hiding something. This former teacher was always so taciturn. Even if she had something on her mind, she probably wouldn't be able to get it out of him. Roddy looked at the bandage on her shoulder, but in his mind, he was thinking about where he should send her and the soldiers to change classes. "I've jumped so many levels in one go. My weapons should be updated. Big risks come with big rewards." Although this was a good thing, Roddy found that he had more things to worry about. Fortunately, it wasn't as if the team couldn't function without him. Sodalar was now the backbone of the team. Not only did he arrange the team dutifully, but he also followed the original plan to take everything that could be taken from the outer city walls. After learning that Roddy had woken up, Sodalar rushed over from the outskirts of the Magic Tower district and reported the team's harvest. "The giant armors are piled up at the city gate, and there's enough food to last us for a long time. These are the things we wanted in the original plan." Sodalar handed over a package, rubbing his temples as he spoke. He rarely complained. Please don't come to this place again. You know, forget about the orcs in the past, they've been fighting dragons and these guys for the past few months. It feels like we'll die from just a touch. We're really blessed by the gods to be able to live until today. You think I want this? I'll just wait for the green-skinned barbarians when I get back. I don't want to run around. Rhodey rolled his eyes and lowered his head to look at the loot. The City Wall District Instance Dungeon had given him most of the blueprints and descriptions of armors and weapons. This included the Dasong's fine steel armor set and the Parma magic crossbow. These items belonged to the category of high-end equipment that humans were currently unable to produce. The average level of these items was around 20, which was the level that the team could use right now. Moreover, this kind of high-end equipment could not be produced by ordinary workshops at all. Only Elson's military factory could produce it on a large scale. Once it was installed, it would definitely surpass the so-called high-level armor and weapons in the kingdom. By the way, do you remember the armor we found in Tar Lake? I took a closer look, and the things here are basically the same as that one. Although Sodeler didn't understand the High Elf language, he could still read the drawings. He was even more curious about who the owner of the armor was. Speaking of armor, he didn't forget to have a soldier bring over a machete. The machete was shockingly long. Even Erwin, who was more than 6 feet tall, held it in his hand. He waved it around. Look, this machete should be part of the armor. There are at least 600 sets in the armory, but they're rather crude. What do you think Solomon is trying to do? Arming the army is only for the sake of war. To him, the purpose of war is probably only revenge. Roddy had originally guessed that the armor was worn by the snow monsters, but now the facts told him that it was probably not as simple as he had imagined. However, he had an idea of what was going on. He said in a low voice, "As for the specifics, I have to go to another place and take a look." What place? I've basically taken people to search around here. Other than the ruins, there's basically nothing left. It's over there, under the tower. Roddy pointed at the magic tower in the distance. This caused Natha, Akasha, and Sodeler's expressions to turn unnatural. What's wrong? Is there a problem? He was a little confused. Was there something scary? I say, what's your relationship with that dragon's? Sodeler thought about it and finally said what he was worried about. You might not know it when you were unconscious, but we saw it clearly. She went over to kill you. If she had been a second late, her knife would have landed on your neck. Akasha had a worried look on her face, while Nada clenched her longbow tightly. Her lowered eyelids were filled with undisguised murderous intent. Roddy was stunned for a moment, but he immediately understood the crux of the matter. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he smiled helplessly and said, "Forget it, it's not clear. Let's go and take a look. Since she didn't make a move in the end, she probably won't do it again." The others looked at each other and finally believed his words unconditionally. They followed him to the magic tower. Marinsura stood in the magic tower for an entire day. From the moment she gave up on killing Roddy, her heart had been in a state of confusion and confusion. This included the fear of death, doubts about trust, and the shaking of her understanding of this world over the years. She had been saved by a human 4 times. No one would believe it if she told others. But now that things had come to this, she had to admit that she owed him too much. But as a dragon's, Marinsura was resistant to the word repay. She would rather fulfill one of Roddy's requests in return, just like the first time she met him. But now she knew that she no longer had the chance to do so. This was not because of Marinsura's emotions, but because she sensed danger. After Barantula completely disappeared, a faint aura of dragons was approaching from the south. According to her judgment, in less than 2 days, she would face another attack from her own kind. It did not matter who the other party was. Marinsura only knew one thing: no matter who it was, she would end up dead. Her people were all dead, and King Solomon's treasure had only cost her half her life. When her hope of revenge was completely extinguished, Marinsura really did not know what to do. Thoughts often led to a dead end when one was in despair. So when Roddy led a group of people into the magic tower, she did not react at all. Thud, thud, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall of the magic tower. The surroundings were full of rubble and cracks left by the battle in Baranchalu. Occasionally, the rocks that were kicked off would echo, making the figure of the shadow dragon look even more lonely and desolate. Marinsura. Roddy called out her name bluntly. This made the mouths of Sodalar and the others twitch. They were afraid that this dragons would turn around and beat them into meat paste. But they did not know that when Marinsura heard Roddy's voice, she only felt awkward. After all, she had wanted to kill her savior, and it was difficult for her to face it calmly. But she quickly suppressed this feeling with her sense of superiority as a dragon's. She turned around calmly and said, "You're awake? Do you need me to escort you out?" Women will always be women. Even a female dragon is a natural Oscar-winning actress, Roddy sighed silently. Then, he carefully looked at the empty magic bar, and was more confident about his idea. He said in a low voice, "That Solomon left something interesting. Are you interested in taking a look?" This sentence almost made Marinsura lose her composure. What did he mean? Something left behind by Solomon? Could it be a treasure? She had tried so hard to find it, but could not find it. Why did you say it so easily? First, she was surprised, then suspicious. Marinsura's eyes flickered several times, but in the end she could not overcome the curiosity and desire in her heart. She stared at the white ring in Roddy's left eye that represented the Dragon Slayer's mark, and said calmly, "Well, there's no harm in taking a look." At this time, Akasha and the others also realized something. This dragon seemed to be trying to put on airs, but it did not seem to have any effect on Roddy. They had never seen a human who could be so unyielding in front of the dragons. Natha, Akasha, and Sodalar sighed as they silently followed behind the two. They looked at each other and did not even have the courage to make jokes. Roddy was completely unaware of this. He glanced at the description of the mission reward of Glory of the Elements, and stopped in front of the octagonal hole in the magic tower. He then looked down. "The interesting thing you're talking about, don't tell me you're referring to the ice crystal vein below?" Marinsura was not an impatient person, but she obviously could not control her expression at this moment. She did not hide the disappointment on her face. "Yes, it is below, but it is not the ice crystal vein." Roddy ignored her. He bent down and began to look for something along the edge of the hole. Each of the 8 edges was covered with profound magewebs. Even with Marinsura's attainments in magic, she could not understand them. Besides, she was not interested in studying magic at all. Therefore, she did not feel anything strange even though the magewebs had been placed in front of her for a day. However, Roddy picked up the red crystal fragment from Baranchalu and placed it into a few grooves. He then used his finger to knock on it. Under Marinsura's astonished gaze, a stone slab moved into position with a click. Misplacing magewebs was a big taboo. It could even cause a serious explosion. However, just as she took a step back, a mirror-like silver barrier suddenly appeared in the center of the octagonal hole. Marinsura's eyes widened as she stared at Roddy in disbelief. "It's here." Roddy did not look surprised at all. It was as if this was normal. This is the dimensional barrier of the secondary plane. It is the area between this plane and the elemental plane. This is what Solomon said in the words he left behind. I don't know if it's true. This explanation was pure bullsh*t. The method to open Solomon's treasure was written in the mission reward. However, Roddy could only find a random excuse to bluff her. Otherwise, Marinsura might find out about his lies. Therefore, he did not give her any time to ask questions. He quickly leaped forward and disappeared without a trace, as if he was submerged in water. Chapter 447. The other three looked at each other and followed closely behind, not daring to breathe loudly. The feeling of entering a dimension was very uncomfortable. It was as if they had been thrown into an enclosed roller coaster and spun around 100 times. When the scenery became clear again, Akasha, who was the weakest among them, almost fell to the ground. Fortunately, Natha supported her from the side. However, the wood elf didn't look well either. Sodalar looked fine, but his left hand gripped the handle tightly to steady himself. He tried to suppress the churning feeling in his stomach. He wanted to see where Roddy was, but when he glanced at the handle he was holding, he almost cried out. It was a longsword on the weapons rack. If it was an ordinary longsword, it would be fine. Sodalar loved swords as much as his life and had seen many before. However, the sword in his hand made him unable to move at all. It wasn't the first time he had seen the High Elves' slender double-edged swords. However, the grip, the material, and the luster of the blade told him that it wasn't ordinary. Even more incredible was that dense elemental waves seemed to float on the sword. It was clearly many times stronger than the enchanted weapons that the nobles bragged about. He raised his hand and drew his longsword. A clear ringing sound rang out as the sword trembled. The perfect center of gravity and the blossoming icy aura almost caused Sodalar's eyes to light up. Good sword! Of course. Sodalar's exclamation was mercilessly interrupted by Roddy. The latter pushed his shoulder and pointed to the side. Take your time. There's nothing bad here. Zordlor, who thought he was experienced and knowledgeable, trembled in fear when he looked in the direction Roddy was pointing. The space before him was almost as big as Elson Library. The surrounding walls glowed with white light, and above them was a vast expanse of whiteness. There was no ceiling or sky at all. Solid stone slabs were under their feet. To their left and right were 5 or 6 shelves made of ice crystals. On them were fancy or simple longswords, staffs, bows and arrows, round shields, and so on. Further away were stacks of scrolls and magic crystal protected by a barrier. Further away, Sodalar found that he couldn't see further because the light of the equipment had already covered everything behind him. Akasha and Natha were just as dazzled by the dazzling equipment as he was. They were in a semi-dazed state, while Marinsara squinted her eyes and clenched her fists as if she was searching for something. Roddy was the only one who didn't have any expression on his face. He looked as relaxed as if he was strolling in a wet market. You can even take this away? Sodalar gulped and his voice changed pitch. Of course. As soon as Roddy finished speaking, Sodalar turned and left. Where are you going? Get someone to move the stuff. If these things were given to us, who in the world would be able to stop us? Where was the door? How to get out? Let me go back and call them. Sodalar wasn't like this in the past, but after leading troops for a long time, he naturally began to think for his brothers. Roddy couldn't help but laugh at this. He pointed to a door of light at the end of the room, and Sodalar quickly ran out. Don't just stand there. See if there's anything useful. These are all good things left behind by Solomon. His last words were very clear. Whoever kills Baranchalu will get these things. Roddy waved his hand and turned to Marinsara. He said in a low voice, Your dragon crystal still hasn't recovered? Marinsara, who had been pretending to be calm, immediately became dispirited. All her sense of superiority actually came from the dragon crystal. Now Roddy mercilessly burst this bubble. She was now no different from a mortal, so what was there to be superior about? Thinking of this, she sighed and shook her head. I thought I could find something here that would allow me to take revenge, but now it seems that I was too naive. For the dragon race, unless it was a divine weapon or a scroll, nothing else would catch their eye. After all, the dragon race was extremely powerful and had no lack of rare treasures. If Solomon's treasure was only the epic-grade equipment that was around level 40 to 55 on average, it would be of no use to Marinsara. Roddy fell silent. After a moment of consideration, he slowly said, "Perhaps there's something that you can use." The shadow dragon didn't believe him at all and didn't even reply. Roddy didn't waste any time and walked straight to the deepest part of the room. Behind the rows of weapons, scrolls, and magic crystal was the most inconspicuous desk among all the treasures. On it were 2 gray leather notebooks without any markings or elemental rhythms. It seemed that this was the most useless thing in the room. But Roddy stopped in front of the desk solemnly. He stretched out his hand and hovered above the 2 books for a few seconds. Finally, he pointed at one of them and said, "Pick it up and have a look." Marinsura frowned slightly. She didn't understand Roddy's action. After all, it was just a notebook. Wasn't it the same no matter who picked it up? But because of her trust in Roddy, she reached out and picked up the notebook. At the same time, elemental rhythms swept across her fingertips and left a clear mark on the surface of the book, Soul Brand. The shadow dragon turned pale with fright. The soul brand she mentioned was actually the soul binding displayed in front of Roddy's eyes. This meant that the notebook belonged to her forever. Even if others opened it, they wouldn't be able to see anything on it. Soul binding was a unique characteristic of top-level items. Roddy had only seen people equipped it in top raid teams. After his rebirth in this world, Roddy had only seen the same attribute on Akasha's ring. As for what it was, Roddy still didn't know. But he was sure that the 2 notebooks on the table were definitely top-level items. Because they represented Solomon's most precious treasure, an inheritance left behind by an elemental magician who could defeat a demigod and was feared by the high elves at their peak. A room full of epic equipment and the inheritance of 2 professional professions. This was the reward from the level 55 legendary mission. Roddy was actually very glad that he made the choice. There were many ways to complete the Glory of the Elements mission. If he only killed Baranchula's physical body, the reward would only be a small part of the equipment and experience points. If he completed the mission perfectly, he could obtain all of Solomon's treasures. And according to the game's evaluation, his completion rate for this mission was 100%. So now, in front of him was the reward that others didn't even dare to think about: the inheritance of the advanced professions Elementalist and Elemental Summoner. Marinsura flipped through the book that represented the inheritance of the Elementalist in her hands. After a few minutes, she suddenly raised her head and stared at Roddy. Her voice trembled as she said, You really want to help me?" Her words sounded a little harsh, as if Roddy couldn't help her at all. But in fact, this was the truth. The grudges between dragons and humans were not on the same level. Marinsura's dragon crystal had completely lost its response due to excessive consumption. Even the leader of the shadow dragons couldn't do anything about it. But it was this problem that the book in his hands could solve. Elementalist and Elementalist that existed everywhere on the continent were only one word apart, but in fact they were completely different. Solomon was able to make a name for himself during the era when Arcane dominated everything because he walked a different path from the Elementalists. In other words, he was the founder of the Elementalist profession. He was the first magician in this world who could directly use the power of the elemental plane to fight. Normal Elementalists needed to rely on spells and hand gestures to gather the elements around them to cast spells. But Elementalists could directly use the energy of the elemental plane for their own use after gaining the ability to connect to the plane. In other words, normal Elementalists used toy water guns, but Elementalists used fire hydrants. The two were not on the same level. More importantly, after Elementalists reached level 30, they could condense magic crystal like magical beasts. With the magic crystal, an Elementalist's mana recovery speed, and spell strength would all be superior to that of a normal magician. And for Marinsura, condensing a magic crystal meant she was standing at the turning point of her destiny. Marinsura was speechless for a moment. This book not only meant that she had obtained the inheritance of a powerful magician, but it also meant that she had a chance to escape from her current, desperate situation. The source of the dragon's aura was the dragon crystal. If she chose to destroy it, her brethren would never be able to find her again. And becoming an elementalist meant that one day, she could condense a magic crystal again, and with hard work, she could cultivate a new dragon crystal. This was a chance for rebirth. This was also the capital for her to take revenge. But the problem in front of her was, Marinsura had never thought of giving up her dragon crystal. This was the symbol of the dragon's identity. Giving it up would mean turning her back on the entire race. Just as this thought rose in her mind, Marinsura suddenly remembered what Roddy had said to her in the tomb of the king. "I don't have dragon scales, and I don't know magic. Even if I work hard for my entire life, I won't be able to match your strength when you were 10 years old. But if I am chased by an enemy, I can do anything to survive. Because one more day of life is one more ray of hope. But this is not to prolong my life, but to take back what I have lost with interest one day." Marinsura's heart was thumping violently. Her originally stubborn thoughts had unknowingly started to change. If there was a chance for revenge, why would she wait for death here like an idiot? Her pale fingers could not help but tremble. The contents of the book were not as short as it looked because of the space folding. Perhaps the book had more than a few thousand pages. However, just by reading the general outline, she realized how valuable the gift Roddy gave her was. Why did he do this? The shadow dragon suddenly remembered the dragon god oath she had made. Her heart couldn't help but beat a few more times, and her face inexplicably flushed. She sneaked a glance at Roddy, only to find that he was engrossed in another book and didn't pay any attention to her. What a bastard! Chapter 448. Just as Marinsura was worrying about her personal gains and losses, Roddy was reading a paragraph of text in front of him with rapt attention. If it was just the job description, Roddy wouldn't have been so focused. However, the moment he received the mission reward, a glory of the elements, finally wrote down all the past deeds of the Elemental King, so Roddy finally figured out the problems that had been troubling him for a long time. Everything was similar to what Roddy had guessed. Solomon was banished by the ruling arcanists because of his obsession with elemental magic. The young and frivolous Solomon wanted revenge, so he became more and more obsessed with the research of the elemental plane. In the end, he successfully created the two jobs, elementalist and elemental summoner. The power of the elementalists didn't need to be mentioned, but the appearance of the elemental summoner was the key to his revenge. He summoned countless elemental creatures from other planes and formed an army. At the same time, Solomon put all his effort into creating armor and weapons, hoping that one day he could return to the High Elves' homeland and avenge himself. This was originally a paranoid revenge story, but before it could even begin, it was stopped by Baranchalu's appearance. The demigod Baranchalu was awakened by his actions, so he commanded the snow monsters living on the glacial plains to clash with Solomon's elemental army again and again. From this, Roddy also learned that the armor at the bottom of Tar Lake wasn't worn by the snow monsters, but the standard armor of the elemental army. The water essence wasn't something naturally formed, but a crystallization from the body of a former high-level water elemental. Back then, the two sides were evenly matched. After a long stalemate, Baranchalu and Solomon decided to personally go into battle, but in the end, both sides suffered heavy losses. Baranchalu was sealed for hundreds of years, and Solomon had to accept the fact that he was dead because of the curse. But before Solomon died, he had carefully planned and only wanted to take revenge. However, he missed one thing. Today, hundreds of years later, almost no one could reach his level of magic at that time. Therefore, the seal that served as the mission activation threshold almost sucked Merlinsura's dragon crystal dry, causing her to suffer permanent damage. Fortunately, Roddy did his best to patch up the loophole, and in the end, Baranchula was completely destroyed. Everything seemed to have ended there. However, Roddy saw that the quest prompt continued to pop up, frowny face tracing the origin. Behind Baranchulu, there might be a power that I cannot comprehend. Mission objective: discover and explore the power behind demigod Baranchulu. The legendary quest was obviously not limited to just this. Similar to Judgment of the White Bone Throne, this kind of high-level quest would usually be a series of quests. Roddy wasn't surprised, but he clearly had no intention of continuing the quest. The current quest level had risen from 55 to 65. Above the demigod level? It's still several light years away from me. Knowing himself, Roddy shook his head and muttered to himself. Then, he silently flipped through the book that represented the legacy of the Elemental Summoner. Do you want to make Elemental Summoner the second advanced class? The moment he opened the book, this notification popped up. Roddy, who once had a second advanced class as Berserker, had already changed his mindset. He knew what he wanted, so he chose to confirm without hesitation. Glancing at the huge amount of experience points, Roddy frowned slightly. He was a little hesitant on how to distribute the experience points. The experience points needed for the second-class advancement was twice as much as the experience points for the first-class advancement. Therefore, even though the Elemental Summoner was currently at level 0, the experience points needed to level up was not low at all. After thinking for a moment, he upgraded the level 10 Witcher to level 13. As a result, Roddy obtained the new skills, Quick Reflexes, and Magic Trap. Freeze. His other basic skills were also upgraded. Quick Reflexes consume 10 stamina. Activate. Greatly increases reaction speed, lasts for 20 seconds cooldown. 10 hours. Magic Trap. Freeze required materials. Ice Magic Crystal, Runic Stone Tablet. Range. Diameter of 6 meters. Effect. Slow down movement speed by 40%. Duration. 1 minute after activation. One was a life-saving skill with a long cooldown, and the other was the most practical trap of the survival series. Roddy could not help but sigh at the value of the two levels. However, he also knew that as he leveled up, the system would give him fewer skills. More skills would have to be learned by himself. He would have to learn new skills through skill books, self-created or modified skills. That was the greatest charm of Earthbreaker. I have time to organize the skills. As he thought about this, he opened the talent column and put all the talent points he had saved into the survival series. Enhanced Trap 2 halves. Increase the duration of the trap by 40% after activation. Extreme Cold 2/3. Freeze Trap has a 6% chance of freezing the enemy every second. Cost of materials increased by 20%. After these enhancements, Roddy's crowd control improved a lot. At least he was more confident in fighting bosses in instance dungeons. He was also more confident in small-scale battles. Even if he had to escape, it would not be too difficult. The basic talent points were added into Enhanced Intelligence. Because Roddy quickly raised the remaining EXP to level 2, Elemental Summoner. In an instant, the status bar showed that Roddy had obtained 6 basic skills. However, the Elemental Summoner did not give him a title like the Witcher. However, after looking at the description of these skills, Roddy nodded in satisfaction. Summoning Contract. Level 1. Summon an elemental creature with summoning materials and sign a contract. The elemental creature's level and duration are determined by the summoning materials and the caster's advanced level. Summoning Material Creation. Basic. This skill did not have a description, but it was a list that could be opened. Roddy casually flipped through it and found that there were over 1,000 types, so he closed it. Magician's Hand. Level 1. Cast a spell with summoning materials. Use condensed elements to move object. The maximum weight increases as the level increases. Frost Dagger, Level 1. Create a Frost Dagger with summoning materials. Lasts for 5 minutes. The item's level and quality are determined by the skill level, character level, and summoning materials. Elemental Condensation, Level 1. Cast a spell with summoning materials. Increases the density of elements within a radius of 5 meters for a short period of time. Lasts for 30 seconds. Elemental Dispersal, Level 1. Cast a spell with summoning materials. Decreases the density of elements within a radius of 5 meters for a short period of time. Lasts for 30 seconds. For Roddy, these 6 skills were really practical. Apart from Mage Hand, which was a skill that all ordinary sorcerers knew, the existence of Contract of Summoning alone was enough to make him ecstatic. Unlike skeletons, zombies, and demons, elemental creatures, although they could only exist for a short period of time, their magic abilities and loyalty were definitely outstanding. At the same time, they were also the most compatible with Roddy's profession as a witcher. For example, Water Elemental had Frost Nova, Ice Cage, or Feet of Frost, which were single or group control spells. Wind Elemental had Swift Speed, and other buffs that increased attack speed and movement speed. The Fire Elemental's powerful attack and the Earth Elemental's wall-like defense need not be mentioned. With this profession, Roddy's strength had almost doubled. In the talent column, there were 3 categories: Oath, Elemental Control, and Infusion. Roddy thought for a moment and added 3 talent points to the first category of Oath, Elemental Power. Elemental Power 3 of 3 increases the level of the summoned elements by 3 levels. Looking at the description of the talent column, Roddy could not help but fantasize about himself showing off in front of his enemies. He could not help but smile. Roddy! What? Roddy was woken up from his reverie. He turned around in a daze and saw Merlina glaring at him angrily. He suddenly remembered that it was not the time to study his skills, so he said, "I'm sorry. I was distracted just now. Do you think this will work?" Marinsara originally wanted to say a few more words, but she was stunned by Roddy's question. To be honest, the Elementalist was not as simple as useful to her, it was a life-saving straw. But when she asked for it, she felt that she owed him too much, and there was no way she could ask for it. The dragons really have too much pride. Roddy saw her hesitation and knew the answer. He smiled and said, "Just take it whether it's useful or not. I have no use for it anyway." There were some things that did not need to be said out loud. Roddy was no longer a rash person, so he turned to Akasha and Natha after saying that, leaving Marinsara in a daze. This dragons was not stupid. After thinking for a while, she understood Roddy's painstaking effort. Now that things had come to this, it would be pretentious of her to refuse. So she pursed her lips, took a deep breath, and seemed to have made a decision in her heart. Solomon's treasures were really bountiful. Roddy looked at the piles of equipment with a calm expression, but his heart was already blooming with joy. Not to mention the advanced magic crystal and magic scroll, these strategic resources were always hard to come by. Apart from these, the rest of the powerful equipment could completely equip a super luxurious team, from long range to short range to spellcasters. This was really a great gift package, but Roddy also had his blissful worries. Due to the high level of the mission, the rewards were also extremely high level. Apart from the consumables, most of the rewards required a total level of 40 and above to use. After a round of screening, Roddy confirmed that only Akasha's level was high enough to equip one of the cloak. The others would not activate the effect of the cloak even if they put it on. Although this cloak had a level limit of 30, it was definitely not an ordinary item. Heart of Ice Cloak, Epic Cloth Armor, a requirement, level 30, equip, Ice Resistance plus 80, 1% chance of complete immunity to ice spells, equip, obtained passive skill, Tranquil Heart, passive effect, maintains the magic power recovery speed in non-combat state, Compared to the equipment that added attributes in Roddy's knowledge, this cloak seemed a little shabby. Not to mention the 1% chance of immunity to all ice spells, the passive skill, Tranquil Heart, alone was enough to make all the mages in the kingdom fight over it. Chapter 449. Already resumed night watch, already resumed night watch, already resumed night watch, already resumed night watch. Important things must be repeated thrice. Magic professions always faced two major problems. 1. Not enough mana. 2. Mana recovery speed was too slow. Most magic professions' mana recovery speed was almost zero during battle. They would only have the time to meditate to recover mana after the battle was over. But after wearing this cloak, even if she did not become a perpetual motion machine, her endurance would at least increase by 3 or 4 times. This was because priests were known for their high spirit attribute. The effect was that their mana recovery speed was much faster than other magic professions. Roddy explained the function of the cloak to Akasha seriously and then helped her put it on. The dark blue cloak inlaid with magic patterns was weaved from the spider silk of the Arachne Lord and stitched by a high elf tailor. After putting it on, Akasha immediately looked indescribably noble. The little priest could not bear to let go of the cloth that flowed with elemental energy. "How do you feel?" "Good, very good." Akasha's lips curled up as she looked left and right. If not for the fact that there were others around, she would probably have already jumped into Roddy's arms and acted like a spoiled child. Roddy was also happy. Didn't he risk his life to make these people he protected happy? As long as she was happy, everything was fine. Ding! A soft sound made Roddy turn his head. He saw that the sound came from a purple dagger in Natha's hand. The attributes of this equipment were suitable for rangers and thieves, so he said, "It's quite suitable for you, but it might be a year before you can use it. If you like it, take it first." "I got it." Natha stammered in reply and obediently put it at her waist. Roddy did not say anything else and continued to look through everything in the treasure room. Apart from the useful equipment on the mission panel, he also found a few oil paintings, notes, and many magic tools with strange effects. Although Solomon was young, he was not just a pedant who studied magic. These byproducts of art or his sudden ideas should be works to relieve his depression. A few minutes later, Sodeler rushed over with his soldiers. Amidst the cheers, the group of old soldiers once again acted like country bumpkins, clicking their tongues in amazement at everything they saw. It was only after Sodeler chased and kicked them a few times that they calmed down and began to move the peerless treasures with shining eyes. These fellows all knew that although their commander was strict with his words, their boss Roddy would always leave the best equipment for them. "Let's make this clear first. Leave the sword to me. I like that saber. Don't fight with me." "Commander, you have to make the decision. I saw this shield first. Old teams were like this." At first, they were strict, but as time passed, they became more casual with each other. After all, this was the brotherhood that had been accumulated through countless life and death experiences. Under the relaxed tone of the conversation, there was a heavy trust. "You brats, stop messing around. Move the things quickly and be careful. If it's broken, don't even think about using it." Sodeler scolded them jokingly as he ordered them to move the equipment. Knowing that there was nothing else for him to do here, Roddy strode out of the room and thought about how to arrange the way back. After passing through the dimensional barrier, Roddy took a deep breath. When the dizziness and discomfort disappeared, he was just about to walk out of the magic tower when Merlin Sarah suddenly appeared behind him and said in a low voice, "Come with me. I have something to tell you." Seeing her walk away with the book in her hand, Roddy understood. He turned around and said a few words to Sodeler before following her upstairs. Merlin Sarah walked in front of him with a graceful figure. Roddy couldn't help but sigh at her figure, which was even more perfect than a statue of a goddess. But even so, Roddy knew that this had nothing to do with him. After walking up 2 floors of the spiral staircase, Merlin Sarah turned and walked into a laboratory with a stone door that hadn't been removed. Then, after Roddy followed her in, she reached out and closed the 2-ton stone door with a loud bang. Is she going to kill me after closing the door? Roddy raised his eyebrows. Then, he felt that this idea was ridiculous. After all, no matter how strong they were, Merlin Sarah was still at level 67. Why would she need to pick a place to kill her? Why, do you have something to say? He wanted to ask, but halfway through his words, he took a step back in astonishment. Merlin Sarah had actually reached out and slowly pulled open the front of her robe. This robe was transformed from Merlin Sarah's dragon scales. After losing the response of the dragon crystal, it had completely lost its attribute bonuses. Now it was quite damaged due to the battle. After she pulled it open, her fair skin was revealed. Roddy almost choked on his saliva, but he quickly realized that Merlin Sarah didn't want to take off her robe. She only revealed the skin around her heart, not her entire chest. Even so, the cleavage still made Roddy's mouth dry. This wasn't because he had any evil thoughts of pushing her down, but because it was a man's instinctive reaction to a woman's body. However, humans weren't animals after all. When Roddy and Merlinsara's eyes met, there were no more unnecessary thoughts in his mind. This was because the Shadow Dragon's expression was so serious that it was almost solemn. Thank you for giving me the chance to make a choice, human. Merlin Sarah wasn't embarrassed by her bare chest. Instead, after taking a deep breath, she said in a calm voice, "Of course. I'm afraid this is the last time I'll call you a human." After saying that, she raised her finger and gently made a few cuts above her heart. Then, she closed her eyes. The cuts formed a strange mark, and her fair skin instantly showed signs of turning into scales. Roddy frowned as he watched this, but he didn't say anything. He just waited quietly. 5 seconds later, a purple crystal slowly emerged from the mark. It was as if it was forcefully pushed out of her heart by some kind of force. After Merlinsara's mouth twitched a few times due to the pain, it finally completely left her skin. Slap. The crystal fell into Merlinsara's hand. At the same time, the white ring that represented the Dragon Slayer mark in Roddy's eyes trembled slightly and completely disappeared. Her overbearing aura quietly disappeared. Her ruddy face became much paler, and the dragon horns on her head gradually shrank until they finally disappeared. When she opened her eyes again, the purple in her pupils had mostly faded, and her long hair had turned black. Just like that, Roddy witnessed the process of a dragon's transforming into a human. Although she didn't show much expression, the shock in his heart was indescribable. It was almost impossible for a dragon's to make such a choice, and the fact that she took out the dragon crystal in front of him showed just how determined Merlin Sarah was. He understood that Merlin Sarah had completely regarded him as a friend, not just a verbal flattery, but a true partner that she was willing to entrust her life to. Phew, after losing the dragon crystal, Merlin Sarah took a deep breath. Her slender fingers tightly grasped the crystal that no longer had any elemental fluctuations. Her lowered eyelashes trembled slightly, and she slowly raised her eyes to meet Roddy's again. This does indeed feel much better. After the dragon crystal left her body, there was no longer any aura of dragons, which meant that the threat of being hunted down by her brethren was completely gone. Therefore, what Merlin Sarah lost was power, and what she gained was the freedom that she had been missing for a long time. Like a prisoner who had just walked out of prison, Merlin Sarah wanted to scream at the top of her lungs, but after the tension in her heart was released, she couldn't speak at all. The only thing she could do was to hastily wipe away the tears that flowed unconsciously from the corners of her eyes. Merlin Sarah had never cried before, and this was the first time she shed tears in her life. It was also the first time an outsider saw the fragile side of her heart. However, she didn't feel embarrassed at all. Instead, she raised her head and handed the dragon crystal that represented her former identity to Roddy. Here, it's for you. In history, the way humans obtained the dragon crystal was always accompanied by killing and hatred. However, Roddy didn't expect that he would be the first human to receive a dragon crystal from dragons. Thank you for giving me a new lease on life, Roddy. From now on, Merlin Sarah would never call him human again. Roddy was still a little dazed at first, but after hearing this, he nodded in realization. He reached out to take the dragon crystal that was still warm and gently caressed it. He said in a low voice, "Then, we're friends now. Perhaps you're the only friend I'll ever have in my life." A smile appeared on Marinsara's face, and there were still some tears lingering on her eyelashes, giving her a breathtakingly beautiful appearance. She had withdrawn her domineering aura, only to reveal the most delicate side of a woman. However, this attitude only appeared for a short moment. When she gently pulled up her robe again, her confident aura didn't change at all. "Alright, that's all. Are you ready to leave this place?" Roddy solemnly put the dragon crystal in his pocket and replied, "Yes, after we move the things here, we'll set off for the barbarians' territory and then return to the kingdom of Karen." The two of them chatted like old friends, but when they pushed open the stone door, Merlin Sarah frowned. "Sigh, it's much harder than before. I think you need to adapt to your current body condition first. After all, you don't have the strength you used to have, and there are many more things that can threaten you." Even so, the force of pushing open the 2-ton stone door still shocked Roddy. After losing the dragon crystal, Merlinsara's level dropped to 40, but her current strength was far greater than that of a level 40 berserker. If she could successfully become an elementalist in the future, her achievements would definitely be limitless. Hearing Roddy's words, Merlin Sarah seemed to be thinking about her next plan, but after a few seconds she sighed and said, "If it was in the past, I definitely wouldn't listen to these words, not even my father. But after losing my power, I really started to consider these things. Sigh, now that I think about it, I've done a lot of reckless things in the past. Young people are capricious, and young people are frivolous." Roddy sighed in his heart, but he didn't say it out loud. After all, he didn't have the right to be someone else's life coach. He just changed the topic. "Where do you plan to go next? Are you coming with us?" "I don't know. Like you said, I need to adapt to my current body first." You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.